Long before the Celts appeared in Greek or Roman records, the foundations of their mythology had already been shaped by a shared linguistic and religious system stretching across prehistoric Eurasia. This belief system, reconstructed by modern scholarship rather than preserved in written texts, reveals that Celtic myth did not emerge in isolation. It developed from a much older Indo-European cosmology whose structures can still be traced through language, ritual, and comparative tradition. Between approximately 4,500 and 2,500 BCE, communities speaking early Indo-European languages occupied vast regions of the Eurasian steppe and adjacent territories. Although these societies left no written records, linguists and historians have reconstructed aspects of their worldview through comparative linguistics, identifying shared religious vocabulary across later Indo-European cultures. Records indicate that recurring mythological concepts, such as divine sovereignty, cosmic order, and ritual obligation, were embedded directly into language itself. This reconstructed system is referred to as Proto-Indo-European (PIE) religion, and it forms the deepest recoverable layer of Celtic mythological thought. At the center of this system stood a sky-associated deity, conventionally reconstructed as Dius Ph2tr, meaning Sky Father. Linguistic descendants of this deity appear across Indo-European traditions: Zeus in Greek, Jupiter, from Iupiter, in Latin, and Dyaush Pit in Vedic Sanskrit. While no direct Celtic textual equivalent survives, the persistence of sky-associated sovereignty deities in later Celtic traditions suggests structural continuity rather than direct transmission. This pattern demonstrates how mythological roles, rather than specific narratives, were preserved as Indo-European societies diverged. Alongside the Skyfather figure, PIE mythology emphasized functional divine roles rather than individualized personalities. Thunder and storm deities occupied a prominent place, often associated with warfare, protection, and cosmic enforcement. Comparative evidence links these figures to later Celtic gods such as Tyrannes, whose name derives from a root meaning thunder. Archaeologists uncovered will symbols and thunder-related iconography in Iron Age Celtic contexts, which scholars interpret as material survivals of earlier Indo-European storm god symbolism. This continuity suggests that certain divine functions remained stable even as names and narratives evolved. Another central feature of Proto-Indo-European belief was the sacral importance of cattle. Linguistic reconstructions show that wealth, status, and social order were closely tied to livestock, particularly cattle. This valuation appears consistently across Indo-European traditions, from Vedic cattle raids to the central role of cattle in the Irish epic Táin Bó Cúailnge. Rather than being a uniquely Irish development, such narratives reflect a deep-rooted Indo-European economic and ritual logic in which cattle symbolized prosperity, legitimacy, and divine favor. The persistence of this motif illustrates how myth encoded economic reality into narrative form. PIE cosmology is also understood to have been tripartite, dividing the universe and society into complementary functions. Building on the work of Georges Dumézil, scholars identify three recurring spheres: sovereignty and law, warfare and force, and fertility and production. While this model remains debated, its explanatory value lies in demonstrating systemic coherence across Indo-European cultures. In Celtic contexts, later gods and heroes often fulfill these roles collectively rather than individually, suggesting adaptation rather than abandonment of the underlying structure. This reflects how myth functioned as an organizing framework rather than a fixed theology. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of ritual behavior consistent with these reconstructed beliefs. Burial practices from the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age show deliberate grave goods placement, directional orientation, and symbolic objects, indicating structured cosmological assumptions. Ritual landscapes, such as causewayed enclosures and ceremonial sites, suggest communal religious activity tied to seasonal cycles. While these findings cannot be directly labeled Celtic, they demonstrate continuity between belief, ritual, and social organization in Indo-European-speaking communities that would later give rise to Celtic cultures. An important interpretive insight emerges from this evidence. Mythology functioned as social infrastructure. It encoded rules of authority, property, and obligation in symbolic form, ensuring continuity across generations in the absence of writing. A second insight follows from comparative analysis. Religious continuity does not require narrative preservation. Even when specific myths are lost, underlying structures, divine functions, symbolic values, and ritual priorities can persist for millennia. A third insight is methodological. Celtic mythology is best understood as a transformation of inherited systems, not as an isolated or purely local creation. Classical sources provide indirect confirmation of this deep continuity. Greek and Roman authors, while writing much later, frequently identified Celtic gods with their own deities through Interpretatio Romana. This practice only worked because functional similarities already existed. When Roman writers equated Celtic gods with Jupiter or Mars, they were recognizing shared Indo-European divine roles rather than inventing equivalences. Such records indicate that Celtic religion remained intelligible within a broader Indo-European framework even in the historical period. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, Indo-European-speaking groups began dispersing more widely across Europe, carrying these mythic structures into new environments. As languages diversified and cultures adapted to regional landscapes, the inherited belief system underwent transformation rather than collapse. By the end of this period, the foundational elements of what would later become Celtic mythology, cosmic order, sacred authority, and ritualized social values, were already in place, prepared to evolve as Indo-European communities migrated westward into Atlantic Europe. Myth adapts when people cross mountains and seas. Between approximately 2500 and 1200 BCE, Indo-European-speaking communities expanded steadily into Western and Atlantic Europe, entering landscapes markedly different from the open steppe environments in which earlier belief systems had formed. This period corresponds with major demographic and cultural transitions identified archaeologically through material cultures such as the Bell Beaker phenomenon and subsequent early Bronze Age societies. While these movements did not represent a single migration event, the cumulative effect was a sustained westward diffusion of language, social organization, and inherited mythic structures. Records indicate that this process coincided with significant religious adaptation rather than wholesale cultural replacement. Archaeologists uncovered evidence that Bell Beaker groups, appearing in Western Europe around 2500 BCE, shared distinctive burial customs, pottery styles, and metalworking practices across a wide geographic range. Although Bell Beaker material culture does not equate directly to a single ethnic group, isotopic studies and burial patterns suggest high mobility and interregional contact. These communities likely spoke early Indo-European dialects, and their ritual practices demonstrate continuity with earlier belief systems, particularly in funerary symbolism and cosmological orientation. Grave goods, including weapons, drinking vessels, and personal ornaments, indicate a worldview linking status, ritual consumption, and ancestral memory. As Indo-European groups settled in Atlantic Europe, they encountered dense forests, extensive river systems, and highly seasonal climates. These environmental conditions reshaped religious emphasis. While steppe societies centered mythic symbolism on open skies and mobility, Western communities increasingly sacralized rivers, springs, wetlands, and wooded spaces. Archaeological finds from river deposits, such as deliberately placed metal objects, suggest that water became a focal point of ritual exchange. This shift does not represent a rejection of inherited cosmology, but rather a reorientation of sacred space to reflect lived geography. Linguistic evidence supports this process of cultural differentiation. During the 2nd millennium BCE, Indo-European dialects in Western Europe began diverging into what scholars identify as Proto-Celtic. This linguistic development is traced through shared phonological changes and vocabulary preserved indirectly in later Celtic languages. Religious terminology adapted alongside language, preserving inherited concepts while applying them to local contexts. Words associated with sovereignty, kinship, and ritual obligation retained Indo-European roots, even as mythic narratives became increasingly localized. One notable transformation involved solar and chthonic symbolism. Archaeological iconography from Bronze Age Western Europe shows increased emphasis on solar motifs, including discs, wheels, and directional alignments in monuments. These symbols are often interpreted as expressions of cyclical time and agricultural renewal. At the same time, chthonic elements, associated with the earth, ancestors, and subterranean realms, became more pronounced. Burial mounds, hoards placed underground, and ritual deposits in bogs suggest growing concern with the boundary between the living world and the ancestral or supernatural domain. Mythological structures adapted to integrate both celestial and terrestrial forces. This period also saw changes in ritual authority and social organization. As communities became more sedentary, leadership structures emphasized territorial control and lineage continuity rather than seasonal mobility. Myth reinforced these shifts by embedding legitimacy within landscape-based narratives. Sacred hills, rivers, and boundary markers became focal points of collective memory, anchoring mythic identity to specific places. Archaeologists uncovered long-used ceremonial sites showing continuity across generations, indicating that ritual space itself functioned as a stabilizing force during periods of cultural change. An important interpretive insight emerges from this evidence. Environment acted as a selective force on mythic expression. Core Indo-European structures, divine function, cosmic order, and ritual reciprocity, persisted, but their symbolic language adjusted to new ecological realities. A second insight is that mythological differentiation occurred gradually, through accumulation rather than rupture. There is no evidence for a sudden religious transformation. Instead, belief systems evolved in parallel with settlement patterns and economic adaptation. A third insight concerns identity formation. Local myth became a mechanism for territorial belonging, reinforcing social cohesion within emerging regional groups. Comparative analysis with later Celtic traditions supports these conclusions. Irish and British mythologies place strong emphasis on rivers, hills, and other natural features as sites of supernatural interaction. These themes are not innovations of the medieval period but reflect Bronze Age processes in which geography became central to religious meaning. Classical authors writing much later would note the Celtic reverence for natural places, a practice rooted in these early adaptations. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, Indo-European derived belief systems in Western Europe had developed distinct regional characteristics. Linguistic divergence into Proto-Celtic coincided with the localization of mythic symbols and sacred geography. While the underlying cosmological framework remained inherited, its expression became increasingly tied to place, ancestry, and seasonal cycles. These adaptations created the cultural conditions necessary for the emergence of identifiable Celtic societies in the early Iron Age, where myth, language, and landscape were fully integrated into a coherent regional tradition. By the Iron Age, myth was carved into metal and stone. Between approximately 850 BCE, the belief systems that had evolved across prehistoric Europe entered a phase of unprecedented material expression. Archaeologists identify this period primarily through the Hallstatt culture, c. 800 to 450 BCE, and the subsequent La Tène culture, c. 450 to 50 BCE, both centered in Central Europe but extending widely across regions later associated with Celtic-speaking populations. Unlike earlier periods, where myth must be inferred indirectly, these cultures left abundant material evidence. Burials, ritual deposits, iconography, and sanctuaries that allows closer examination of how belief, power, and identity interacted. The Hallstatt period is characterized by elite-controlled societies with pronounced social stratification. Archaeologists uncovered richly furnished burials, including large mound graves containing weapons, wagons, imported luxury goods, and feasting equipment. Sites such as Hochdorf and Vix demonstrate that political authority was closely tied to ritual display. The presence of banqueting vessels and drinking horns suggests ceremonial practices that reinforced elite legitimacy. Mythological concepts of sacred kingship and divine ancestry are inferred from these contexts, as authority appears symbolically linked to cosmic order rather than mere coercive power. Religious symbolism during the Hallstatt period remains restrained but deliberate. Decorative motifs emphasize geometric order, solar symbolism, and animal forms associated with strength and protection. Archaeologists interpret these elements as visual expressions of cosmology rather than aesthetic preference. The careful placement of grave goods and the orientation of burials indicate belief in an ordered universe governed by reciprocal obligations between the living, the dead, and the divine. This aligns with earlier Indo-European concepts of sovereignty and ritual balance, now expressed through hierarchical material culture. The transition to the La Tène period marks a significant shift in both artistic style and mythological expression. La Tène art is distinguished by curvilinear designs, dynamic animal forms, and complex symbolism rendered in metal, stone, and wood. Rather than depicting narrative scenes, this art encodes meaning through repetition and abstraction. Motifs such as birds, boars, horses, and serpents appear consistently, suggesting associations with warfare, fertility, liminality, and divine protection. These symbols correspond closely with later textual descriptions of Celtic deities and mythic themes. One of the most striking features of La Tène religious expression is the prominence of the human head. Archaeological evidence, including carved stone heads, skull niches in sanctuaries, and classical accounts, indicates that the head was regarded as a locus of power. Roman writers such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus describe Celtic warriors preserving the heads of enemies, though these accounts must be treated cautiously due to cultural bias. When combined with archaeological data, however, they suggest a symbolic system in which the head represented identity, vitality, and supernatural potency rather than mere brutality. Another recurring motif is the cauldron, most famously exemplified by the Gundestrup cauldron, dated to the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE, decorated with scenes of deities, warriors, animals, and ritual activity. The cauldron provides rare iconographic insight into late Iron Age belief. Scholars interpret it as a ritual object associated with renewal, sacrifice, and possibly initiation. While its exact origin remains debated, its imagery reflects a shared symbolic vocabulary across Celtic Europe, reinforcing the idea of a broadly coherent mythological system. La Tène sanctuaries further illuminate religious practice. Excavations at sites such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribemont-sur-Anker reveal enclosures containing weapon deposits, animal remains, and human bones. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of structured ritual activity rather than chaotic violence, including deliberate placement and periodic renewal. These sites suggest that warfare itself had ritual dimensions, with victory offerings reinforcing relationships between warrior elites and the divine realm. Myth, in this context, functioned as a framework legitimizing conflict and authority. 3 interpretive insights emerge from the Hallstatt and La Tène evidence. First, mythology became increasingly visible as social complexity increased. Elites used religious symbolism to legitimize power in stratified societies. Second, symbolic consistency across regions indicates shared belief structures, even in the absence of centralized religious institutions. Third, material culture served as a primary medium for mythic transmission, compensating for the continued reliance on oral tradition rather than writing. Classical authors provide additional, though imperfect, context. Herodotus makes limited references to Western peoples, while later Roman writers such as Caesar describe druids, sacrificial practices, and beliefs in the immortality of the soul. Although these accounts reflect external perspectives, they align in key ways with archaeological findings, particularly regarding the integration of religion, warfare, and social order. Their testimony suggests that Iron Age Celtic belief systems remained intelligible within the broader Indo-European religious landscape. By the late Iron Age, Celtic mythology had achieved a stable and recognizable form. Its core structures, sacred authority, warrior ideology, ritual reciprocity, and symbolic animals, were embedded in material culture across much of Europe. With these archaeological foundations established, the belief system that would later be recorded in medieval texts begins to take clearer shape. With material culture firmly in place, the Celtic pantheon itself becomes increasingly discernible, setting the stage for the identification of individual deities and their functions in the chapters that follow. The Celtic world did not end at the horizon, it overlapped. Celtic mythology reflects a structured conception of the universe, dividing reality into three interconnected domains: land, sea, and sky. This tripartite cosmology was not merely symbolic. It organized the social, political, and ritual life of Iron Age communities. Archaeological evidence, including the placement of ritual deposits, orientation of burials, and monumental alignment, indicates that these divisions were observed materially. Textual sources, primarily medieval Irish manuscripts, reinforce the presence of a structured otherworld that parallels the human domain. The otherworld is not a distant afterlife but an interwoven reality accessed through liminal sites and ritual practices, highlighting the spatial and temporal complexity of Celtic cosmology. Sacred sites were central to this tripartite worldview. Groves, rivers, springs, and hills functioned as points of contact between the human and supernatural realms. Archaeologists uncovered votive offerings, including metal weapons, ceramics, and animal remains, deposited deliberately in rivers and wetlands across Western Europe. Sites such as the Mourne Mountains and river sanctuaries in Gaul demonstrate continuity of ritual practice across centuries. These locations were deliberately chosen for their geographic and symbolic properties, indicating that sacred space was defined both by environmental features and cultural interpretation. This practice suggests that the landscape itself served as a cosmological map, integrating natural phenomena into the religious imagination. Within this spatial framework, the otherworld is depicted as layered and overlapping rather than linear. Irish texts describe multiple realms, often invisible to ordinary humans, inhabited by deities, ancestors, and supernatural entities. Archaeological parallels include subterranean chambers, bog deposits, and enclosed sanctuaries, all of which indicate deliberate spatial separation for ritual purposes. The physical and symbolic separation between realms reflects a belief that sacred actions required specific conditions and places. By structuring access to divine or supernatural power, communities reinforced social hierarchy and ritual authority. Interpretive analysis indicates that the tripartite cosmology served multiple functions. First, it organized religious practice spatially, ensuring that ritual behavior aligned with a coherent model of the universe. Second, it codified social hierarchies, with kings, warriors, and priests mediating between realms in prescribed ways. Third, it reinforced environmental awareness, embedding cosmology into the natural world. These insights reveal that myth was not a narrative abstraction but a practical framework guiding human interaction with both society and environment. Evidence for celestial association is particularly prominent. Solar and astral motifs appear in La Tène artifacts, including discs, wheels, and ceremonial metalwork, suggesting that the sky domain held regulatory and symbolic importance. Water and vegetation symbolize the land domain, while rivers, lakes, and the sea connect human communities to ancestral and liminal forces. This spatial division aligns with Indo-European models of tripartite cosmology, showing continuity with Proto-Indo-European religious structures while adapting to the Atlantic European environment. Archaeological and textual data together indicate that the Celtic universe was both structured and relational, integrating natural, social, and supernatural dimensions. Sacred architecture and ritual enclosures further illustrate this principle. Excavations at sanctuaries such as Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribe-Mont-sur-Ancre reveal carefully delineated ritual zones that separate human activity from divine presence. Deposits of offerings, structured pathways, and recurring spatial patterns demonstrate that ritual efficacy depended on precise placement and orientation. These patterns also suggest that mythic narratives were encoded in landscape and site planning, allowing communities to interact with cosmic principles materially. Another interpretive insight concerns liminality. Access points between realms, groves, riverbanks, or constructed enclosures functioned as thresholds where temporal and spatial rules shifted. Rituals performed at these liminal sites were governed by strict rules, emphasizing the relational aspect of power between humans and the otherworld. This illustrates that Celtic cosmology was not only descriptive but operative, guiding behavior and legitimizing authority through spatial practice. A third insight is the integration of myth and geography in social memory. By embedding sacred stories in identifiable natural features, communities ensured intergenerational continuity. Place names, local legends, and persistent ceremonial sites encode cosmological knowledge, demonstrating that myth operated as a cultural infrastructure, linking environmental knowledge with social and spiritual norms. By establishing this tripartite structure and codifying sacred space, Celtic cosmology provided a comprehensive framework for understanding human and divine interaction. The land, sea, and sky domains, along with the layered otherworld, shaped the behavior of priests, kings, warriors, and ordinary people alike. This worldview created the structural conditions in which deities could act within human affairs, and it laid the foundation for the development of a recognizable Celtic pantheon in subsequent periods. In Celtic myth, time returns. Celtic societies conceptualized time not as linear succession but as cyclical recurrence, closely linked to agricultural, seasonal, and ritual patterns. Festivals such as Samhain, marking the onset of winter, and Beltane, heralding the summer season, structured both social and religious life. Early Irish texts, including the Book of Invasions, Leber Gabala Iren, and Annalistic records, preserve these temporal frameworks, showing that ritual calendars governed the rhythm of labor, warfare, and ceremonial activity. Archaeological evidence, from burnt mounds to ceremonial enclosures, supports continuity of these cycles, revealing that temporal organization was integral to social cohesion and cosmological understanding. Cyclicality in Celtic temporality functioned to renew both social and cosmic order. Samhain, for instance, was a liminal period when boundaries between the human world and the otherworld were most permeable. Textual sources describe rituals of protection, divination, and ancestor veneration, emphasizing the restoration of equilibrium at seasonal thresholds. Archaeologists have identified corresponding material practices, such as deposits in bogs and hearth-related offerings, indicating that cyclical observances were materially enacted. These recurrent rites reinforced hierarchy, legitimized leadership, and maintained communal cohesion. Beltane and similar festivals demonstrate the interweaving of agricultural and mythic temporality. By marking periods of sowing, grazing, or harvest, festivals synchronized human activity with ecological cycles. The repetition of ritual across years established a temporal rhythm that linked past, present, and anticipated future. Interpretive analysis suggests that these cycles codified knowledge of environmental conditions while embedding mythic significance into practical survival strategies. The recurrence of festivals reinforced cosmological principles and maintained the authority of priestly and royal intermediaries. Celtic temporal structures were inherently functional. Time operated as a mechanism for moral and social reinforcement, rather than as an abstract chronology. Heroic narratives, seasonal rites, and legal obligations were performed within established cycles, ensuring that myth actively shaped behavior. For example, heroic tales associated with festival periods illustrate the consequences of transgression or failure in alignment with cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from enclosed ceremonial sites indicates repeated use, consistent with the cyclic interpretation of myth and ritual. An interpretive insight arises from the relationship between myth and ritual timing. Cyclical festivals codified social norms into natural and supernatural order. A second insight is that mythic temporality facilitated continuity, ensuring that social memory persisted across generations through repetitive ceremonial practice. A third insight is methodological. Combining textual and archaeological data demonstrates that temporal cycles were tangible and enforceable, rather than abstract literary constructs. Material evidence underscores the spatial and temporal integration of festivals. Sites such as Hill of Tara and other ritual centers show structured arrangements aligned with solar, lunar, or seasonal markers, suggesting that time was materially inscribed into the landscape. Deposits of offerings, periodic reconstructions, and orientation of ritual enclosures reinforce the idea that sacred time was enacted in coordinated space. Such practices illustrate that cyclicality was central to the organization of both sacred and secular life. Textual sources reinforce this model. Irish annals and mythological cycles consistently associate festivals with heroism, divine intervention, and social adjudication. By situating myth within seasonal time, these narratives maintained functional relevance, allowing stories to operate as prescriptive rather than purely illustrative. The recurring performance of these stories within ritual calendars demonstrates a deliberate embedding of mythic authority within temporal cycles. A final interpretive observation concerns temporal elasticity. The Celtic calendar allowed periods of liminality where ordinary social rules were suspended, permitting negotiation with the otherworld. This feature reflects an understanding of time as a flexible tool, enabling the community to reconcile natural, social, and spiritual dimensions. Festivals served both as markers of continuity and as controlled intervals for adaptation and renewal. By codifying recurring festivals and embedding myth within seasonal and ritual cycles, the Celts developed a functional temporal framework. This cyclicality structured agriculture, social hierarchy, and ritual practice, ensuring continuity of both community and cosmology. Within this temporal framework, gods assumed defined social roles, interacting with humans at predictable intervals and reinforcing the balance between earthly and otherworldly domains. Rule was sacred, or it failed. Celtic mythology consistently links human authority, divine sanction, and cosmic balance. Central to this framework are the concepts of fate, ord, and personal prohibition or obligation geis, which impose constraints on rulers and heroes alike. Literary sources, including early Irish sagas such as the Táin Bo Cuailnge and Cath Maige Tuired, frequently depict leaders whose success or failure depends on adherence to these metaphysical principles. Archaeological evidence, such as richly furnished elite burials and ceremonial enclosures, supports the notion that kingship was not merely a political office but a ritualized role intertwined with sacred legitimacy. The principle of ord can be understood as an overarching moral and cosmic law governing human action. Breaches of ord frequently result in catastrophe, both social and personal. The geis, by contrast, represents a conditional obligation placed upon an individual, often by supernatural or symbolic authority. Together, these structures function to enforce social cohesion and ensure alignment with cosmic order. For example, narratives describe heroes bound by geasa, prohibitions they cannot violate without incurring death or defeat, demonstrating that myth operated as a mechanism for moral and social regulation. Sovereignty is frequently personified through goddesses who confer authority upon kings, thereby linking human rule to divine consent. Literary examples include figures such as Eriu, Banba, and Medb, whose favor is essential for legitimate governance. Classical observers, including Caesar in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, note the ritual significance of these figures in Celtic political systems, though accounts require cautious interpretation. Archaeological correlates, such as elite female burials, ritual deposits, and ceremonial sites, indicate that female authority was materially recognized and symbolically integrated into kingship. An interpretive insight emerges from the alignment of fate, geis, and sovereignty. Myth codified accountability into rulership, ensuring that political authority was inseparable from ritual observance and ethical comportment. A second insight is that cosmic balance underpinned social stability. Leaders were held responsible not merely for secular governance, but for maintaining harmony between human and divine realms. A third insight relates to continuity. These structures reflect a persistent Indo-European conceptual inheritance, linking Celtic authority to broader prehistoric models of sacred kingship. Material culture supports these textual observations. Excavated ceremonial sites, such as enclosures associated with early Iron Age elites, reveal evidence of feasting, votive deposition, and ritual performance, activities that may have symbolically enacted the conferment of sovereignty. Iconography on metalwork and carvings often depicts motifs of animals, divine attributes, or ritual paraphernalia, reinforcing the connection between material display and ideological legitimacy. These patterns indicate that mythology was not abstract but actively reinforced hierarchical and sacred structures. Literary and inscriptional evidence demonstrates that the consequences of violating sacred obligations were narratively and socially codified. In sagas, Heroes who ignored their geasa suffered defeat or death, emphasizing the inseparability of personal morality, communal expectation, and cosmic principle. Similarly, kings who failed to secure divine favor risked social destabilization, reflecting a system in which political legitimacy depended upon alignment with mythic law. These narrative structures illustrate that Celtic myth functioned as a prescriptive tool, guiding behavior and reinforcing social order through supernatural consequence. Another interpretive insight concerns the role of gendered divine authority. The repeated appearance of sovereignty goddesses suggests a formalized understanding of kingship as contingent rather than inherent. Human rulers were mediators of power granted and maintained by divine sanction, reinforcing the principle that sacred authority superseded individual ambition. Archaeological findings, including votive offerings and ritualized sites, corroborate textual patterns, demonstrating continuity between narrative and practice. Finally, the interaction of fate, sovereignty, and cosmic balance situates myth within a broader structural system. Time, seasonal cycles, and ritual observance intersect with personal obligation and divine sanction, creating a cohesive framework through which society interpreted success, failure, and legitimacy. This system functioned to stabilize hierarchical structures while embedding moral and spiritual responsibility into political life. By the end of this period, these principles of fate, geis, and divine sanction were firmly embedded in Celtic mythology, providing a model in which rulers, heroes, and deities operated within a regulated cosmic order. These principles are embodied by the gods themselves, setting the foundation for the development of a fully articulated pantheon and its interaction with human society in subsequent chapters. Celtic gods were defined by function, not form. Across Iron Age Europe, the Celtic pantheon was structured less around individual personality than around functional roles that maintained social and cosmic order. Deities such as Lugus/Lugh, the Dagda, and Brigid exemplify this approach, with attributes and activities reflecting spheres of war, fertility, law, craftsmanship, and ritual authority. Roman observers often interpreted these deities through Interpretatio Romana, equating Lugus with Mercury, the Dagda with Jupiter, and Brigid with Minerva. While these identifications are filtered through external perspective, comparative analysis with native textual, linguistic, and archaeological evidence demonstrates the enduring functional logic underlying Celtic divine systems. Lugus/Lugh, widely attested across Gaulish and Irish sources, embodies the principle of multifunctionality. He is associated with skills, crafts, commerce, and war, fulfilling roles that ensure societal stability and prosperity. In inscriptions from southern Gaul, dedications to Lugus frequently emphasize his capacity as a patron of trade and craftsmanship, suggesting that communities invoked divine sanction to regulate economic and martial activity. Early Irish texts, including the Leber Gabala Iren and the metrical Dinshenkas, preserve stories in which Lugh's diverse skills reinforce hierarchical and ritual order, demonstrating continuity of functional roles across temporal and regional contexts. The Dagda, a central figure in Irish mythology, is similarly defined by capacity rather than narrative personality. Associated with abundance, fertility, and kingship, the Dagda's symbolic attributes, a large club, cauldron, and harp, encode specific functions: protection, sustenance, and harmony. Literary sources describe him orchestrating victory, ritual feasts, and seasonal cycles, illustrating the integration of divine action with human social needs. Archaeological evidence, such as votive cauldrons and ceremonial enclosures, parallels these textual attestations, reinforcing the concept that mythic figures were operational within communal practice rather than purely literary constructs. Brigid, appearing both as a goddess of fertility, poetry, and craft, and as a liminal figure mediating between human and supernatural realms, demonstrates the codification of functional domains in the divine feminine. Early Christian texts often Christianize Brigid, indicating her enduring cultural resonance. Linguistic continuity of her name and associated festivals, particularly Imbolc, suggests a persistent social and ritual function spanning pre- and post-Roman contexts. Archaeological and environmental evidence, including wells, springs, and sacred sites, points to consistent patterns of cultic practice associated with fertility and renewal. An interpretive insight emerges from these examples. Celtic divine authority was inherently operational, emphasizing the societal and ecological roles of gods rather than personal narrative traits. A second insight is that Roman interpretatio provides functional confirmation, not distortion. External observers consistently recognize the alignment of deities with specific societal spheres, validating the structural logic of the pantheon. A third insight concerns cross-regional continuity. While iconography, ritual forms, and local narratives varied, the underlying functional roles remained coherent across Celtic Europe. Functional specialization extended to war and law. Gods associated with combat, such as tyrannies, provided supernatural sanction for martial activity, often invoked in conjunction with ritual practices at high places or through votive offerings. Similarly, deities connected to legal and moral order, frequently represented through sovereign goddesses, reinforced kingship and the legitimacy of social hierarchies. Archaeological evidence, including fortifications, votive weapons, and ritual deposits, reflects these functions materially, demonstrating how divine authority was enacted in daily life. Pan-Celtic deities were also adaptable. Functional roles allowed the same deity to operate under different names and forms across regions, accommodating linguistic and ecological variation without compromising structural coherence. For instance, Lugus appears in Gaul as Lugus, in Britain as Lug, and in Ireland as Luff, consistently associated with skill, leadership, and mediation. Similarly, fertility and agricultural functions are encoded in both Brigid and local river or grove deities, illustrating functional syncretism. This adaptability underpins the resilience of Celtic religion across geographic and temporal contexts. Material culture further reinforces this interpretation. Iconographic motifs, such as wheels, spirals, and animals, frequently appear in ceremonial objects, weaponry, and personal adornment. These motifs encode functional associations rather than narrative episodes, aligning with the operational logic of the pantheon. Archaeologists interpret repeated symbolic patterns across diverse sites as evidence that communities engaged with gods as functional agents, shaping daily, seasonal, and ritual activity. Finally, textual, archaeological, and epigraphic data collectively demonstrate the interdependence of divine, human, and environmental systems. Festivals, ritual sites, and dedications function to maintain alignment between the community, landscape, and pantheon. Gods were invoked at predictable intervals for predictable outcomes, reinforcing cyclicality, social hierarchy, and ecological awareness. Their identity was flexible, but their function was precise. By defining gods primarily through function rather than form, the Celtic pantheon created a coherent, adaptable system capable of integrating regional diversity. These pan-Celtic deities provided the structural backbone for subsequent localized divine forms, allowing communities to adapt inherited functions to specific landscapes and social contexts. Local landscapes produced localized divine identities, setting the stage for the emergence of regional cults and specialized deities in the following sections. A god's name changed, but their role endured. As Celtic-speaking communities dispersed across Western Europe, regional variation in deity names and worship practices emerged while functional roles remained consistent. Archaeological and textual evidence from Gaul, Britain, and Ireland demonstrates that local environmental, linguistic, and social contexts produced distinctive pantheons. Inscriptions, place names, and votive deposits reveal both continuity with pan-Celtic deities and localized innovation. This fluidity underscores a central feature of Celtic religion. Gods were defined by function and symbolic role, allowing identities to adapt to specific cultural and geographic contexts without compromising cosmic or societal order. In Gaul, inscriptions frequently invoke deities such as Lugus, Tutatis, and Tyrannis, often alongside Roman equivalents in the practice of interpretatio Romana. Dedications from sites such as Lyon, Entremont, and Alesia show that worshippers emphasize protection, legal authority, and warfare, reflecting functional roles rather than narrative attributes. Place names incorporating divine elements, including Totatus-derived toponyms, indicate long-term regional attachment. Archaeological deposits, ranging from sanctuaries to ritual weapons in rivers, confirm that religious activity was materially embedded and regionally distinctive, even as broader Indo-European motifs persisted. In Britain, epigraphic and material evidence highlights a combination of continuity and adaptation. Deities such as Boudica's patron gods, Lugus, and Tyrannes appear in inscriptions alongside dedications to localized river and hill spirits. Place names, particularly those referencing sacred springs, well names, and hills, dun, suggest integration of pre-existing ritual landscapes into Celtic cosmology. Archaeologists have recovered ritual deposits in rivers and bogs, including weapons, coins, and animal remains, which echo Gaulish patterns but reflect British ecological and social realities. These findings indicate that local environmental conditions influenced divine expression while preserving inherited functional roles. Ireland provides a more textually abundant, though chronologically later, record. Medieval manuscripts such as the Book of Invasions, Liber Gabala Iren, the metrical Dinshenkas, and early annals preserve a detailed pantheon including Lugh, the Dagda, Brigid, and sovereign goddesses. While the literary record postdates the Iron Age, linguistic analysis confirms that many names and functional associations reflect earlier Proto-Celtic traditions. Rivers, hills, and sacred sites remain focal points of deity localization, demonstrating continuity with Bronze and Iron Age ritual practice. Archaeological evidence from ritual enclosures, bog deposits, and metalwork parallels literary patterns, providing material confirmation of enduring sacred functions. Interpretive insights emerge from these regional patterns. First, deity names were flexible while functional roles remained stable, allowing communities to adapt inherited cosmology to local languages and environmental contexts. Second, ritual behavior and spatial practice codified divine authority, ensuring continuity across generations despite nominal variation. Third, integration of pan-Celtic and local elements reflects a layered cosmology, in which inherited Indo-European structures were adapted to address region-specific ecological and social conditions. The process of localization often involved syncretism with natural features, particularly watercourses, forests, and elevated terrain. Sacred rivers, such as the Shannon or Seine, and groves or hills in Britain and Gaul, functioned as loci for divine interaction. Depositional patterns, including votive weapons, ceramics, and occasional human offerings, demonstrate continuity in the enactment of functional roles, whether invoking fertility, sovereignty, or martial protection. These material practices anchored myth in specific landscapes, embedding cultural memory into geography. Another insight involves ritual specialization. Certain deities maintained core functions across regions while acquiring secondary attributes relevant to local concerns. For example, Lugus's role as a multi-skilled protector of society is consistent in Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, yet he may be associated with trade in one region and martial victory in another. This functional plasticity allowed communities to maintain coherent mythological logic while responding to environmental, political, or social variation. Classical sources provide additional, though external, confirmation of this pattern. Roman writers, including Caesar and Pliny, noted regional differences in worship practices among continental Celtic populations. While these accounts are filtered through Roman perception, they corroborate archaeological evidence of diverse ritual forms and localized divine expression. The combination of material and textual sources underscores the interplay of consistency in function and variability in local identity. Finally, linguistic and toponymic evidence reinforces the dynamic between inherited pantheon and regional adaptation. Place names preserving deity elements, ranging from river names to hilltop shrines, demonstrate continuity of sacred landscape. Such names often survive long after ritual practices ceased, highlighting the durability of functional association over nominal identification. This pattern illustrates that divine roles, rather than specific narrative identities, constituted the operative structure of Celtic religion. By examining Gaulish, British, and Irish contexts, It becomes clear that regional pantheons maintained inherited functional roles while adapting to local environments and cultural circumstances. This dynamic produced a pluralistic but coherent Celtic religious framework. These gods acted within mythic narratives, shaping heroism, seasonal cycles, and ritual practice, and setting the stage for the detailed examination of mythic storytelling and legendary cycles in subsequent sections. Myth preserved memory through divine conflict. Celtic mythology structures its pantheon not merely through functional specialization but also via divine relationships, kinship networks, and hierarchical interactions. Irish myth cycles, particularly the mythological cycle and Ulster cycle, provide extensive accounts of gods, goddesses, and supernatural beings interacting in familial, political, and martial contexts. These narratives illustrate generational succession, rivalry, and alliance, encoding social and cosmological principles into mythic memory. Archaeological and textual evidence together suggest that these hierarchies were conceptually aligned with human societal organization, reflecting both inherited Indo-European models and localized cultural evolution. The Tuatha Dé Danann, central figures in Irish myth, exemplify a pantheon structured around generational and functional hierarchy. The Dagda, often described as father or leader of the gods, presides over fertility, abundance, and ritual authority, while Lugh embodies youthful innovation, skill, and warrior prowess. Sovereignty goddesses such as Eriu, Banba, and Fadla mediate kingship and territorial legitimacy. The interplay among these figures often manifests as conflict or negotiation, with generational succession reflecting shifts in cosmic and social authority. Textual records describe these interactions in narrative form, preserving an ordered mythic memory that parallels human social concerns. Kinship and lineage shape much of divine hierarchy. Gods and goddesses are frequently depicted as offspring, siblings, or spouses, establishing networks that mirror societal norms of inheritance and alliance. Generational conflict, illustrated in narratives such as the Second Battle of Mag Twyard, demonstrates both continuity and transition. Elder deities maintain authority, while younger figures assert new functions. These stories encode principles of legitimacy, succession, and balance, providing both mythic precedent and explanatory frameworks for contemporary social practices. Rivalries and conflict are integral to this hierarchical structure. Mythic contests, whether over sovereignty, territory, or ritual prerogative, reflect the functional responsibilities of deities and their alignment with societal norms. For example, battles among the Tuatha Dé Danann and their adversaries, the Fomorians, symbolize the struggle between order and chaos, reflecting broader cosmological and political principles. Archaeological correlates, including fortified ritual sites and deposition of weaponry in rivers, indicate that such conflicts were ritually enacted, reinforcing narrative structures through material practice. Another interpretive insight is the codification of social and moral norms through divine hierarchy. Hierarchical relationships among gods mirror human authority patterns, with kings, warriors, and priests modeled by interactions among deities. Compliance with divine precedent, whether through ritual observance or recognition of rank, reinforced both political legitimacy and cosmic balance. A second insight is that divine generational conflict functions as mnemonic architecture, preserving societal memory of succession, alliances, and obligations. A third insight emphasizes functional continuity. Despite narrative elaboration, deities maintain consistent roles within their hierarchies, reflecting systemic stability across regional variation. Textual evidence, including saga literature and mythological poetry, consistently aligns these hierarchies with ritual and ceremonial practice. Depositions, votive offerings, and sanctuaries correspond with zones associated with particular deities, reinforcing hierarchical structures in spatial and functional terms. The integration of material culture and narrative demonstrates that divine conflict and authority were operational principles, not merely literary constructs, governing both human and mythic behavior. The interconnectedness of divine roles also reflects adaptive flexibility. Deities often embody multiple functions simultaneously, and their relationships allow for dynamic resolution of competing responsibilities. For instance, Luffa's interaction with the Dagda or sovereignty goddesses integrates martial, ritual, and administrative functions, emphasizing the relational nature of divine authority. This relational hierarchy enabled communities to negotiate complex social realities symbolically, maintaining coherence even amid regional variation or ecological change. Archaeological evidence supports this view. Sites associated with the Tuatha De Danann, identified through later textual correlation, sacred hills, or ritual deposits, reveal structured spatial hierarchies. Enclosures, votive deposits, and ritual zones indicate differential access and function, suggesting that mythic hierarchies were materially reflected in human practice. Repeated deposition patterns reinforce generational and functional distinctions, demonstrating that divine relationships were codified into both landscape and practice. Finally, the correspondence between divine and human hierarchies reinforces the didactic function of myth. By modeling leadership, conflict resolution, and succession among gods, myth provided paradigms for human governance and social interaction. Heroes, kings, and priestly figures are consistently situated within frameworks derived from divine precedent, illustrating the pervasive influence of hierarchical cosmology. Mythic memory, therefore, serves both as a repository of sacred knowledge and as a practical guide for societal organization. By structuring the pantheon through kinship, rivalry, and hierarchical ordering, Celtic mythology created a durable system that encoded both functional and relational authority. These patterns preserved cosmological balance while providing narrative frameworks for human social practice. These divine structures mirrored human society, preparing the conceptual foundation for the interaction of gods, heroes, and mortals in the mythic narratives explored in subsequent chapters. Rome feared what it could not fully understand. Druids occupy a central place in classical accounts of Celtic religion, yet these descriptions must be evaluated critically. Roman authors, including Julius Caesar, Strabo, and Pliny the Elder, provide the earliest detailed commentary on Druidic practice, portraying them as priests, judges, and teachers. Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico emphasizes their influence over both spiritual and political life in Gaul, noting that Druids administered legal disputes, instructed youth, and oversaw sacrifices. Strabo and Pliny corroborate these functions, often highlighting ritualized justice, the veneration of natural sites, and ceremonial observances, though their accounts are inevitably filtered through Roman perspective and political agenda. Classical sources consistently associate Druids with sacred authority and social mediation. According to Caesar, Druids were exempt from military service and taxes, reflecting their elevated societal status. They acted as intermediaries between the community and the divine, controlling access to knowledge, ritual practice, and moral guidance. Strabo notes that they wielded considerable influence over both kings and assemblies, reinforcing the idea that religious authority was inseparable from political power. Pliny further emphasizes their role in divination and ritual oversight, particularly in the context of sacrificial offerings to rivers, groves, and celestial bodies. Archaeological evidence, while indirect, supports these functional claims. Sacred groves, riverine offerings, and votive deposits, including weapons, ceramics, and animal remains, correspond to sites described in classical texts. Material continuity across regions and centuries suggests that Druids operated within structured ceremonial frameworks, rather than as informal or marginal religious actors. These findings reinforce interpretive insights from textual sources. Druids were mediators of both cosmic and social order, shaping law, ritual, and seasonal observance. Interpretive analysis reveals several key insights. First, Druids were institutionalized religious specialists, whose authority derived from both ritual knowledge and social recognition. Second, classical fear and fascination with Druids reflect Roman perception of religious power intertwined with political influence, highlighting the perceived threat of autonomous spiritual authority outside imperial control. Third, the accounts demonstrate the continuity of indirectly documented ritual practice, corroborated by archaeology, across Celtic Europe. However, limitations of classical sources must be acknowledged. Caesar's writings serve propagandistic purposes, framing Druids as influential enough to justify Roman intervention. Strabo and Pliny, relying on second-hand reports, often conflate observation with anecdote. Despite these biases, the consistent description of Druids as legal, ritual, and educational authorities indicates that their societal role was widely recognized and substantial. Cross-referencing these accounts with archaeological patterns allows for a more balanced reconstruction of their functions. Classical sources also emphasize the Druids' connection to natural and liminal sites. Groves, rivers, and hills are consistently cited as locations for ritual activity, suggesting that Druids mediated between the human and sacred domains in spatially organized ways. This aligns with the broader Celtic cosmology, where sacred geography and temporal cycles structured social and religious behavior. Druids appear to have managed these intersections of place, time, and ritual, functioning as custodians of both tradition and cosmological order. By the mid-1st century BCE, Druids had become both symbols of Celtic distinctiveness and targets of Roman anxiety. Their influence over kings, assemblies, and ritual practice represents a unique integration of religious, legal, and educational authority. Archaeological evidence and comparative textual analysis indicate that this role was both institutionalized and regionally adaptable, allowing Druids to mediate local traditions while maintaining coherence with pan-Celtic religious structures. While classical authors provide valuable insight into Druidic authority, native sources, particularly early Irish and Welsh texts, offer additional perspectives that illuminate their intellectual, ritual, and moral functions within Celtic society. These sources deepen our understanding of Druids beyond Roman observation, revealing the full scope of their sacred and social authority. Knowledge itself was sacred. Native Celtic sources, particularly early Irish and Welsh manuscripts, provide a complementary perspective on Druidic function, emphasizing their roles as judges, historians, and ritual specialists. Unlike classical accounts, which often focus on power and spectacle, these texts depict Druids as custodians of legal precedent, genealogical knowledge, and ritual precision. Works such as the Liber Gabala Iren, Brehon Laws, and medieval Welsh triads preserve traditions in which Druids acted as mediators, educators, and arbiters of social and cosmic order. In legal contexts, Druids functioned as judges and advisors. Irish Brehon law codes describe roles analogous to modern magistrates. Druids interpreted customary law, resolved disputes, and ensured that rulings aligned with both societal norms and sacred precedent. Their authority derived from knowledge of ancestral custom, genealogical rights, and moral obligation. Archaeological parallels, such as ceremonial enclosures associated with elite assemblies, suggest that legal and ritual functions were often intertwined, with Druids serving as the interface between human society and cosmic order. Druids also acted as historians and genealogists, preserving knowledge of lineage, territorial claims, and heroic deeds. Oral transmission was central, and Druids trained apprentices in memorization, poetic composition, and narrative structuring. Early Irish texts often credit Druids with maintaining the continuity of myth and history across generations. This function ensured that communal memory, social hierarchy, and cosmological understanding were embedded within accessible, performative narratives. Archaeological findings, such as inscribed stones and ritual deposits, provide material support for the cultivation of memory and cultural continuity. In their ritual specialization, Druids performed ceremonies connected to fertility, seasonal cycles, and ancestral veneration. Texts describe offerings, invocations, and the consecration of sacred spaces, aligning human activity with broader cosmic rhythms. Archaeological evidence, including bog deposits, votive offerings, and structured ceremonial sites, confirms the material enactment of these practices. Such integration of narrative, law, and ritual underscores the multidimensional authority of Druids in both symbolic and practical terms. Interpretive analysis highlights three insights. First, Druids acted as knowledge mediators, structuring society around codified law, ritual precision, and historical memory. Second, Their authority illustrates the interdependence of intellectual and sacred power. Possession of knowledge equated to social and spiritual influence. Third, the combination of textual and material evidence demonstrates that Druidic practice was institutionally embedded, maintaining continuity across regions and generations despite the absence of formal written records during the Iron Age. Druids' roles also reinforced social hierarchy and political legitimacy. By overseeing legal, ritual, and historical frameworks, they regulated succession, mediated disputes, and endorsed leadership. Their participation in ceremonial life codified social norms and ensured that myth, history, and law were mutually reinforcing. This system reflects broader Celtic principles of cosmic balance, where human governance and ritual observance were inseparable from divine sanction and seasonal cycles. Finally, Druids were central to myth transmission. Through instruction, oral recitation, and ritual performance, they preserved narrative frameworks that structured heroism, divine action, and seasonal observance. Their role ensured that myths were not static tales but operational tools that guided behavior, reinforced authority, and maintained cosmological continuity. Material culture, including ritual deposits, sacred spaces, and commemorative objects, demonstrates that these functions were enacted physically, integrating mythic knowledge with lived experience. By codifying law, history, and ritual, Druids served as the intellectual backbone of Celtic society. Their authority shaped the organization of knowledge, the administration of justice, and the enactment of sacred practice. Their authority shaped myth transmission, ensuring that the pantheon, heroic narratives, and ritual cycles persisted across generations, forming the structural foundation for the cultural memory explored in subsequent chapters. Myth survived by voice. Oral tradition was the primary medium through which Celtic myths, laws, and histories were preserved. Druids, bards, and other learned specialists relied on rigorous memorization techniques, poetic structure, and mnemonic devices to maintain accuracy across generations. Early Irish and Welsh sources emphasized that writing was initially taboo for sacred knowledge, with oral transmission considered superior for preserving ritual precision, social authority, and cosmological integrity. Stories, genealogies, and laws were recited publicly and ritually, embedding communal memory within performance and social life. Memorization techniques employed by Druids and bards combined rhythm, alliteration, and repetitive narrative patterns. These devices facilitated the accurate retention of complex genealogies, legal codes, and mythic cycles. For example, heroic epics and genealogical records often use structured verse forms, enabling recitation over long periods without significant distortion. Archaeological evidence of ceremonial enclosures and feasting sites suggests that oral performance occurred in socially sanctioned contexts, linking memorization with ritual, hierarchy, and communal validation. The taboo on writing reflects both practical and ideological considerations. Written texts were rare and sometimes regarded as inappropriate for sacred knowledge, which required performative engagement to maintain authority and efficacy. Oral transmission ensured that knowledge remained dynamic, socially controlled, and responsive to context, while simultaneously preserving its traditional form. Early manuscripts, created centuries later, capture these traditions retrospectively, providing textual confirmation of practices that were fundamentally oral in origin. Interpretive insights highlight three key points. First, oral transmission functioned as a mechanism of social cohesion, ensuring that legal, mythological, and genealogical knowledge was shared, recognized, and enforced collectively. Second, the emphasis on voice and performance reinforced ritual authority, as the act of recitation itself validated the knowledge being transmitted. Third, the eventual transcription of oral traditions into manuscripts demonstrates a transitionary phase, where preservation and broader dissemination became possible, yet the texts reflect structures and motifs optimized for memorization rather than literary invention. Oral tradition also enabled regional variation within a coherent framework. While stories could adapt to local landscapes, rulers, and social conditions, mnemonic structures maintained core cosmological, functional, and moral principles. For example, Hero tales from Ulster or Munster share common narrative arcs, genealogical lineages, and ritual motifs, even as local features or leaders are incorporated. This flexibility allowed Celtic mythology to survive through centuries of social and political change while remaining recognizable and authoritative. Material culture provides additional support. Objects associated with ritual performance, such as musical instruments, ceremonial staffs, and inscribed markers, may have served as mnemonic cues or performance aids. Depositions of these objects in ritual contexts suggest that oral recitation was integrated into wider ceremonial practice, reinforcing both memory and social legitimacy. Archaeological patterns also indicate continuity between oral and material culture, demonstrating that storytelling and ritual action were inseparable in the maintenance of cultural knowledge. Finally, the oral preservation of myth ensured the survival of heroic narratives and cosmological frameworks into the medieval period. Bards and druids transmitted foundational tales of gods, heroes, and sacred cycles, which later appeared in manuscripts such as the Liber Gabala Iren, Tain Boquailnge, and Welsh triads. These texts, while recorded centuries later, reflect structures optimized for oral recitation, preserving both narrative content and mnemonic organization. Oral tradition thus functioned as a bridge between pre-literate Iron Age practice and textual medieval culture, ensuring continuity of Celtic mythology and societal memory. Through disciplined memorization, ritualized recitation, and social oversight, oral tradition preserved myth, law, and history across generations. Its methods maintained accuracy, authority, and functional coherence, even in the absence of writing. This oral tradition preserved heroic narratives, establishing the foundation for the literary and material transmission of Celtic culture explored in subsequent chapters. Before heroes ruled Ireland, gods did. The mythological cycle of early Irish tradition presents a prehistorical narrative in which divine and supernatural figures actively shaped the land, law, and society. Preserved primarily in medieval manuscripts such as the Liber Gabala Iren, these stories chronicle successive invasions of Ireland by supernatural peoples, culminating in the arrival and settlement of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Unlike later heroic cycles, where mortals dominate the narrative, the mythological cycle positions gods as direct actors in governance, warfare, and territorial negotiation, functioning as proto-heroes whose actions model kingship, skill, and cosmic order. Central figures in the cycle include the Dagda, whose authority as a culture-bearer manifests in ritual leadership, abundance, and orchestration of seasonal and social rhythms. Luff, representing mastery, innovation, and multifunctional skill, and Nuada Ergitlam, embodying lawful kingship and physical perfection. Their deeds, ranging from battles against the Fomorians to the allocation of territory, serve as functional exemplars, demonstrating how divine agency establishes societal structures and legitimizes human authority. These narratives emphasize operational attributes over personality, illustrating that myth functioned as a blueprint for both governance and ritual propriety. Archaeological evidence provides limited but meaningful context. Ritual landscapes, including hilltop enclosures and ceremonial mounds, correspond to sites associated in texts with divine activity. Elite burials containing weapons, metalwork, or symbolic objects suggest continuity between social hierarchy, ritual performance, and mythic representation. While direct identification of Tuatha Dé Danann figures in the archaeological record is impossible, these material patterns reinforce the functional framework present in literary sources, demonstrating how myth and social practice were intertwined. Interpretive analysis highlights several points. First, the cycle illustrates a transition from cosmological to socio-political authority, as divine figures enact laws, mediate territorial disputes, and establish precedents for human rulership. Second, the narratives demonstrate the integration of martial, ritual, and agricultural functions, with gods embodying multiple roles necessary for societal stability. Third, by encoding sovereignty, conflict resolution, and legitimacy within the actions of gods, the mythological cycle provides a template for later heroic and epic narratives, ensuring continuity between divine and human domains. The cycle also emphasizes ritualized conflict as a mechanism for cosmic and social balance. Battles between the Tuatha De Danann and other supernatural groups, such as the Fir-Bolg or Fomorians, are described not merely as warfare but as a negotiation of sovereignty, social order, and ritual legitimacy. Classical observers noted parallels between ritualized combat and civic or seasonal observance, and modern scholarship interprets these stories as codifying moral, legal, and hierarchical norms. Mythic battle, therefore, functions as both narrative drama and social instruction. Regional variation is evident in the textual record. Different manuscript traditions preserve variant genealogies, local topographies, and functional emphasis for divine actors. Despite these differences, the core roles of the gods remain coherent, reinforcing skills, leadership, and cosmic stewardship. This consistency underscores the structural logic of the pantheon and its operational influence over early Irish society, particularly in ritual and legal contexts. A final insight concerns narrative continuity. By portraying gods as proto-heroes, the mythological cycle bridges cosmological authority and human action, allowing later epic cycles, such as the Ulster and Fenian cycles, to inherit functional narrative roles. Human heroes take on challenges, victories, and social responsibilities once associated with divine figures, ensuring that myth remains a living repository of social norms, martial ethics, and ritual practice. By the conclusion of this section, the mythological cycle demonstrates that gods functioned as active proto-heroes, integrating kingship, skill, and ritual authority into narrative form. Their deeds established templates for sovereignty, conflict resolution, and legitimacy. As divine figures receded, human heroes inherited their narrative roles, transitioning myth from the realm of gods to the domain of legendary mortals in subsequent cycles. War defined honor in the heroic age. The Ulster cycle, composed in its earliest forms during the early centuries CE and preserved in medieval manuscripts, presents a vivid narrative of heroism, kingship, and warfare centered on the Kingdom of Ulster. Its core text, the Táin Bua Cailnge, Cattle Raid of Cooley, chronicles a series of conflicts over cattle wealth, illustrating the intertwining of martial prowess, legal obligation, and social hierarchy. Central figures such as Cú Chulainn, whose feats of combat are legendary, and King Conchobar mac Nessa, whose authority is circumscribed by custom and council, exemplify the societal ideals of heroism and governance. Heroic actions in the Ulster cycle are best interpreted as exaggerated expressions of elite martial culture rather than fantasy. Cú Chulainn's single-handed defense of Ulster, his ritualized combats, and his adherence to Gisa, personal prohibitions, reflect social expectations for warrior conduct, courage, and loyalty. Legal and social norms, including fosterage, honor price, and the obligation to uphold kinship rights, are embedded within the narrative, demonstrating that myth codified behavioral standards for elites. Archaeological evidence, such as high-status weaponry, fortified sites, and ceremonial deposits, provides material context for these martial ideals, corroborating textual emphasis on warrior prestige. The Ulster cycle also emphasizes territorial control and economic wealth, particularly the symbolic and practical value of cattle. Cattle raids are not mere narrative devices but reflect the centrality of livestock as both wealth and status in early Irish society. These conflicts function as structured episodes in which social, economic, and martial responsibilities are tested, revealing the interdependence of material resources and hierarchical authority. Ritualized combat and cattle protection are portrayed as extensions of both political and cosmological order, reinforcing community cohesion through narrative exemplars. Leadership in the Ulster cycle is codified through kingly and advisory roles. Conchobar's decisions are mediated by druids, legal specialists, and warriors, reflecting a system in which authority is exercised within defined norms rather than through arbitrary power. Cú Chulainn's feats, while extraordinary, operate within these frameworks, illustrating a balance between personal valor and collective obligation. This narrative structure reinforces social hierarchy while providing a model for ethical and ritualized conduct. Interpretive insights emerge from these patterns. First, The cycle demonstrates that heroic narratives encode societal norms, linking martial success to ethical behavior, loyalty, and legal compliance. Second, the emphasis on cattle, kinship, and territoriality highlights the integration of economic, social, and martial structures in early Irish communities. Third, the depiction of personal obligation, particularly through Gisa, illustrates the intertwining of individual choice and communal expectation, reflecting the broader Celtic principle that cosmic and social order are mutually reinforcing. Regional and temporal variation is also evident. Manuscript traditions preserve differences in genealogies, episode sequences, and character emphasis, yet the core societal functions remain coherent, reinforcing norms of warrior conduct, kingship, and conflict resolution. Archaeological corroboration, including defensive structures, ceremonial deposits, and evidence of feasting and hospitality, supports these narrative frameworks, demonstrating that the Ulster cycle reflects structured social realities rather than purely imaginative invention. Finally, the cycle's treatment of age, mentorship, and succession provides insight into generational roles within heroic society. While youthful heroism dominates through Cú Chulain's exploits, older figures and advisors guide decision-making, illustrating an intergenerational balance of experience and valor. This balance ensures continuity in leadership, reinforces social norms, and preserves communal memory through storytelling. By codifying warrior ethics, legal obligation, and social hierarchy, the Ulster cycle provides a functional mythic framework in which heroism, kingship, and material wealth are inseparable. The narratives demonstrate that myth serves as both a repository of cultural knowledge and a prescriptive guide for elite behavior. While Ulster emphasized youthful heroism, other cycles explored maturity and decline, setting the stage for narratives in which experience, moral consequence, and the passage of time shaped the depiction of legendary figures. Heroism did not end, it aged. The Fenian cycle presents a markedly different perspective on Celtic heroism compared with the youthful exploits of the Ulster cycle. Centered on Finn Mac Cumhale and the semi-nomadic warrior band known as the Fianna, these narratives depict a group operating largely outside the formal structures of kingship, likely reflecting social conditions between the 3rd and 6th centuries CE. The Fenian stories emphasize loyalty, mentorship, and negotiation between personal honor and emerging centralized authority. Unlike the Ulster heroes, whose lives are dominated by singular martial feats, Fenian figures age, retire, and confront the consequences of social and political change, illustrating the dynamic evolution of mythic values over time. Finn himself embodies the intersection of experience, wisdom, and continued martial competence. While youthful prowess is central to his early exploits, later narratives stress counsel, governance of the Fianna, and reflection on past conflicts. This portrayal aligns with the broader social reality of semi-nomadic warrior elites, who relied on both martial skill and strategic alliance building to maintain status. Literary motifs, such as the mentorship of young warriors and the structured rotation of leadership within the Fianna, codify principles of loyalty, collective responsibility, and ethical conduct. The Fenian cycle also highlights the tension between semi-autonomous warrior bands and centralized kingship. Stories frequently depict interactions between the Fianna and regional rulers, revealing negotiation, tribute, and, occasionally, conflict. These narratives encode moral and social expectations, illustrating that even those operating outside conventional authority remained bound by obligation, honor, and ritualized norms. Archaeological parallels, including evidence of transient settlements, fortified seasonal encampments, and ritual deposits, suggest that such semi-nomadic lifestyles were socially recognized and materially sustained. Interpretive insights from these patterns are threefold. First, the cycle demonstrates mythic adaptation to social change, reflecting the consolidation of political authority and the shifting roles of warrior elites. Second, aging and retirement of heroes indicate temporal realism within myth, preserving continuity while acknowledging human limitations. Third, the emphasis on mentorship, loyalty, and collective cohesion illustrates the enduring functional role of myth in reinforcing ethical and hierarchical norms within changing society. The Fenian cycle also shows the influence of Christianization and moral restructuring. Later redactions incorporate themes of penance, ethical restraint, and social accountability, suggesting that these narratives function both to preserve pre-Christian ideals and to adapt them within evolving cultural frameworks. The interplay between traditional martial ethics and emergent moral codes demonstrates the plasticity of myth, capable of retaining functional relevance even as social and religious contexts transform. Heroic aging is further reflected in the ritual and ceremonial dimensions of Fenian narratives. Seasonal feasts, initiation rites, and symbolic hunting practices underscore continuity between martial, ecological, and social functions. The stories embed these practices within narrative form, linking heroism to sustained participation in communal and ritual life rather than singular feats. Material evidence, such as portable ritual objects, hunting gear, and strategically placed votive deposits, reinforces the social and symbolic frameworks described in texts. Finally, the Fenian cycle preserves ethical and social memory, mediating between past and present. Through stories of loyalty, mentorship, and intergenerational transmission, these narratives codify norms for warrior conduct, leadership, and communal cohesion. Unlike the Ulster cycle, which celebrates immediate martial glory, the Fenian narratives reflect the long-term consequences of heroism, including adaptation to social change, aging, and the negotiation of power within evolving political structures. By emphasizing aging, loyalty, and social adaptation, the Fenian cycle demonstrates the evolution of Celtic heroism from youthful, martial glory toward sustained ethical and communal responsibility. These narratives illustrate how myth remained a functional tool for encoding social norms, even as political, religious, and demographic conditions shifted. Parallel heroic traditions developed in Britain through Welsh mythology, extending this model of evolving heroic narrative across Celtic-speaking regions. Violence was regulated, not chaotic. The warrior class in Celtic society occupied a distinct social position, balancing martial responsibility with legal and ritual obligations. Archaeological evidence, including weapon burials, fortified hilltop settlements, and ceremonial deposits, demonstrates that elite warriors were materially and symbolically marked within society. Classical authors, such as Caesar and Strabo, consistently emphasized the prestige of warriors, noting that martial ability conferred social influence, political authority, and economic reward. Rather than serving expansionist imperial agendas, warfare was largely seasonal, localized, and status-driven, reflecting community defense, resource protection, and personal or clan honor. Elite warriors were often distinguished through burial practices. Graves containing swords, spears, shields, and occasionally chariots suggest both social prominence and ritualized acknowledgement of martial skill. These burials, sometimes accompanied by votive deposits, indicate that martial prowess was inseparable from spiritual and communal recognition. Fortified hilltop sites and enclosure systems further reflect strategic defensive planning, demonstrating that warfare was organized, anticipatory, and socially regulated rather than arbitrary. Classical texts provide additional context for understanding warrior status. Caesar observes that Gaulish societies valorized individual prowess, with young men trained from adolescence in weapons handling, horsemanship, and combat ritual. These accounts emphasize that warriors were integrated into both social hierarchy and legal frameworks, serving as protectors of kin, enforcers of custom, and agents of localized authority. Roman writers also noted the performative aspects of martial culture, including ritualized duels, ceremonial armament, and the public display of weapons, reinforcing social cohesion and codifying expectations of conduct. Mythic narratives magnified the warrior role by supernaturalizing combat and heroism. The Ulster and Fenian cycles depict extraordinary feats of strength, endurance, and tactical ingenuity, situating human warriors within frameworks that emphasize ethical, legal, and ritual responsibility. These stories encode behavioral norms. Courage, loyalty, and obedience to lawful authority are celebrated, while violation of social or ritual codes often results in divine or narrative sanction. Heroic exaggeration, therefore, functions as a form of moral and social instruction, reinforcing the regulated nature of violence. Interpretive insights emerge from this evidence. First, warriors operated within structured social hierarchies, where martial ability reinforced but did not override legal and ritual authority. Second, seasonal and localized warfare reflects community-centered objectives, rather than expansionist ambition, aligning martial activity with ecological cycles, economic necessity, and social obligation. Third, mythic narratives serve as a didactic amplifier, projecting human responsibility into narrative extremes to maintain social norms across generations. Archaeological and textual evidence also demonstrates regional variation. In Gaul, fortifications and chariot burials suggest both defensive priorities and elite display. In Ireland, narrative emphasis on cattle raids, fosterage obligations, and dueling illustrates that social prestige, kinship, and wealth were central to warrior status. Despite differences in practice, the underlying principle remains. Warriors functioned as both protectors and potential destabilizers, mediating the tension between individual ambition and communal stability. The warrior ethos extended beyond the battlefield. Training, ritual observance, and ceremonial participation were as critical as combat itself. Weapons, armament, and martial displays were embedded within ritualized practice, demonstrating the inseparability of social, spiritual, and martial dimensions. Archaeological deposits, such as offerings of weapons in rivers or bogs, highlight this integration, reflecting a worldview in which violence was codified and controlled within sacred and social parameters. Finally, the warrior class exemplifies the interaction between material culture, social hierarchy, and mythic reinforcement. Archaeological indicators of martial status correspond closely with literary portrayals, suggesting that narrative exaggeration reflected and codified real social structures. By situating warriors within cosmological, legal, and ceremonial frameworks, Celtic society ensured that violence served communal, economic, and symbolic purposes rather than arbitrary destruction. Through the combination of archaeological evidence, classical observation, and mythic narrative, it is clear that Celtic warriors held a regulated and socially essential role. Myth magnified this role through supernatural battle narratives, establishing ideals of honor, loyalty, and skill that reinforced both social hierarchy and moral expectation, setting the stage for exploration of warfare, strategy, and ritualized combat in the subsequent sections. Heroic combat exceeded human limits. Celtic myth and early Irish literature frequently depict warriors entering a state of extraordinary martial intensity, known in Irish as riostrad or battle frenzy. This phenomenon, exemplified in the exploits of Cuchulainn and other heroes of the Ulster cycle, describes a physical and psychological transformation in which a warrior's strength, speed, and resilience surpass ordinary human capability. Riostrad episodes are carefully codified, often accompanied by descriptive narrative markers such as distorted facial features, supernatural cries, and unmatched combat efficacy, signaling both heroism and symbolic authority. These depictions are closely tied to social and ritualized expectations of elite warriors. Supernatural motifs extend to divine or enchanted weapons, such as Luffa's spear or magical swords and shields wielded by prominent figures. These arms, frequently described as invincible or capable of extraordinary effects, are interpreted as symbolic exaggerations of martial training, technological skill, and social prestige. Rather than implying literal magic, these narratives reflect the elevated status of elite warriors, whose prowess was socially and ritually sanctioned. Archaeological parallels, including high-quality weapons, ceremonial armaments, and deposition of weapons in rivers or bogs, reinforce the connection between material culture and mythic representation, demonstrating that these symbolic enhancements were grounded in tangible prestige and ritual significance. Heroic invulnerability, another recurrent motif, similarly emphasizes social and narrative function rather than literal interpretation. Shields, protective armor, or magical interventions often render the hero impervious to harm in narrative sequences, underscoring the exemplary nature of their role. These features highlight two core functions. First, to codify elite behavior as aspirational and instructive, and second, to distinguish narrative heroes from ordinary participants, reinforcing social hierarchies and martial norms. Such exaggeration mirrors the structured expectations placed upon warriors in real Celtic society, where skill, courage, and adherence to ritual codes determined honor and status. Interpretive analysis identifies several insights. First, Hallstatt and related motifs reflect ritualized and socially amplified combat behavior, translating practical training and ethical responsibility into narrative spectacle. Second, divine or enchanted weapons function as symbolic markers of authority, communicating legitimacy, status, and moral power within both story and society. Third, heroic invulnerability encodes principles of ritual and ethical expectation, demonstrating that martial prowess was inseparable from lawful conduct, loyalty, and societal oversight. The interplay between human and supernatural elements is particularly evident in depictions of group combat. Heroes often face overwhelming odds, yet narrative structures emphasize discipline, strategy, and adherence to ritual obligation. For instance, Cuchulain's Hallstatt frequently coincides with moments of social or legal significance, such as defending territory, upholding fosterage duties, or protecting kin. This illustrates that combat was culturally and morally regulated, and narrative exaggeration served to magnify both martial and social ideals. Archaeological evidence complements textual accounts. Sites associated with warfare, such as hill forts, ceremonial enclosures, and sacrificial deposits, indicate that martial activity was ritualized and spatially organized. Weapons found in bogs or rivers may reflect ceremonial dedication, linking combat practice to sacred observance. These material traces support the interpretation that narrative exaggerations, including Hallstatt, were not merely literary devices but symbolic codifications of real social, martial, and ritual practice. Regional variation is also evident. In Gaulish and British Celtic sources, heroic exaggeration is present but less formalized than in Irish Hallstatt narratives, suggesting local adaptation of similar symbolic frameworks. Across these regions, however, the principle remains consistent. Elite warriors were expected to embody extraordinary skill, regulated aggression, and socially sanctioned power, and myths codified these expectations in memorable and instructive form. Finally, these motifs establish a direct connection between martial performance and societal order. By linking heroic frenzy, divine weaponry, and invulnerability to ritual, legal, and hierarchical structures, myth reinforced the integration of combat with communal and cosmological principles. Heroic exaggeration served not only as entertainment or inspiration but as a vehicle for transmitting social norms, codifying warrior ethics, and maintaining ritualized authority. By portraying Hallstatt, enchanted arms, and invulnerability, Celtic narratives demonstrate that heroic combat was both symbolic and socially functional. These motifs elevated human warriors into moral and ritual exemplars, magnifying real martial behavior into narrative form. Warfare was inseparable from ritual obligation, embedding combat within ethical, legal, and cosmological frameworks that structured both story and society. The enemy's power did not die with them. In Celtic society, the severed head held profound symbolic and social significance, functioning as a tangible emblem of power, spiritual potency, and political dominance. Archaeological evidence, classical accounts, and later literary references indicate that head-taking was not gratuitous violence but a culturally codified practice linking warfare, ritual, and cosmology. Roman observers, including Julius Caesar and Strabo, noted the Celtic custom of displaying enemy heads in public spaces, associating them with prestige, deterrence, and spiritual efficacy. These accounts, while filtered through Roman interpretation, corroborate material findings, such as skull deposits in rivers, bogs, and fortifications, suggesting ritualized practices embedded within martial and civic frameworks. Archaeology provides critical context. Sites across Gaul, Britain, and Ireland reveal carefully prepared deposits of human skulls, often with evidence of decapitation, modification, or ceremonial placement. High-status burials occasionally contained severed human remains, indicating that the head was regarded as a repository of identity and power. Weapons, altars, and votive offerings associated with these deposits suggest a ritualized performance, transforming acts of violence into socially and spiritually meaningful gestures. This material evidence aligns with classical descriptions of heads displayed in assemblies, on stakes, or in sanctuaries, demonstrating continuity between practice and perception. The motif of the head also appears prominently in mythological and heroic narratives, particularly in the Ulster and Fenian cycles. Heroes, including Cu Chulainn and members of the Fianna, are depicted as capturing, displaying, or speaking to severed heads, symbolically asserting dominance, enforcing social norms, or accessing knowledge. These narratives suggest that the head functioned as a conduit of spiritual or narrative power, preserving memory, authority, and identity even after death. Heroic exaggeration in literature mirrors the symbolic potency attributed to real-world head-taking, reinforcing societal recognition of martial and ritual skill. Interpretive insights emerge from these observations. First, the severed head served as a tangible emblem of social and spiritual authority, linking the warrior's martial success with ritual and cosmological principles. Second, head-taking reflects a regulated form of violence, codifying the warrior's ability to channel power rather than merely inflict destruction. Third, the integration of archaeological evidence, classical testimony, and literary motifs indicates that these practices were structurally embedded, not random acts, reinforcing hierarchy, law, and ritual observance. The practice also demonstrates intersections between warfare and sacred authority. Heads were sometimes offered to rivers, bogs, or ritual enclosures, symbolically returning enemy potency to the cosmos or securing divine favor. This integration of combat and ritual underscores a worldview in which martial action, spiritual order, and social status were inseparable. Roman accounts, while occasionally sensationalized, consistently recognized the symbolic weight of the head, suggesting that the cultural logic of head-taking was widely understood, codified, and socially enforced. Regional variation is evident in both archaeological and textual records. In Gaul, display of enemy heads on fortifications emphasized political deterrence and community prestige, while in Ireland, literary sources highlight the ritualized and symbolic aspects of head-taking in heroic and legal contexts. Despite differences in form, the principle remains consistent. The severed head embodied continuity of power, memory, and authority, linking individual action to communal and cosmological order. Head-taking also functioned as a pedagogical and mnemonic device, reinforcing societal norms and heroic exemplars. Narratives describing the collection and display of heads often coincide with lessons in loyalty, courage, and adherence to social obligation. By combining martial skill with ritualized performance, the practice encoded complex moral, political, and cosmological expectations, transmitting them across generations. Material evidence, including ceremonial deposition sites and votive offerings, further supports the role of ritualized violence as a socially constructive practice rather than purely destructive. Finally, head cults illustrate the symbolic amplification of warrior identity. By capturing the enemy's head, a warrior concretely demonstrated skill, courage, and adherence to social and ritual norms. These acts served both practical and symbolic functions, deterring rivals, asserting dominance, and integrating martial success into broader cosmological and communal frameworks. Mythic exaggeration in narrative sources, such as talking or prophetic heads, reflects and reinforces these cultural logics. Through archaeology, classical testimony, and literary evidence, it is clear that head-taking was a regulated, meaningful, and socially embedded practice. Ritual violence extended beyond the battlefield, functioning as both a conduit for spiritual power and a codifier of social hierarchy, linking martial action, ritual observance, and communal memory in Celtic society. The landscape itself was sacred. Celtic religious practice was deeply intertwined with natural landscapes, with groves, springs, and rivers functioning as primary centers for ritual and social activity. Archaeological evidence, including votive deposits, inscribed stones, and structured ceremonial enclosures, demonstrates that these locations were intentionally designated as sacred. Textual sources, including early Irish and continental inscriptions, emphasize the ritual significance of watercourses and wooded sites, suggesting that they served both as focal points for communal worship and as liminal spaces bridging the human and otherworldly realms. Groves, or nemetin, were among the most important natural sanctuaries. Often located on hilltops or near settlement boundaries, these woodland sites were cleared and structured to accommodate gatherings, legal adjudication, and ritual performance. Archaeological traces include post holes indicating temporary or permanent structures, as well as ceremonial deposits of metalwork, weapons, and animal remains. These practices suggest that groves functioned as both ritual theaters and social arenas, where community hierarchy, mythic commemoration, and spiritual observance intersected. Springs and rivers were equally central. Water was perceived as a medium of communication with deities and ancestors, and archaeological evidence shows systematic deposition of offerings, including coins, weapons, and sculpted objects, into these bodies. Inscriptions invoking divine favor, protection, or healing often accompany such deposits, indicating the perceived efficacy of ritual interaction with hydrological features. Literary sources such as the Mabinogion and early Irish sagas reinforce these associations, linking rivers and wells with prophecy, sovereignty, and healing practices. Interpretive insights highlight the integration of natural and social order. First, sacred landscapes reflect cosmological structuring of space, where topography mediates human action and ritual meaning. Second, votive deposition and site modification demonstrate the materialization of belief, embedding spiritual authority within tangible markers. Third, continuity of site use over centuries indicates that ritual landscapes functioned as repositories of communal memory, linking successive generations through shared sacred geography. These sacred sites also structured ritual behavior and temporal cycles. Seasonal festivals, legal assemblies, and initiation rites were frequently tied to specific groves or water sources, reinforcing social cohesion and the alignment of human activity with ecological and cosmological rhythms. Archaeological evidence of repeated deposition, hearths, and constructed platforms supports this understanding, suggesting that ritual behavior was systematized, performative, and socially regulated rather than ad hoc. Regional variation is evident in the prominence of particular landscape features. In continental Gaul, rivers such as the Seine and Loire received votive deposits and structured offerings, while hilltop groves were central to Celtic assemblies. In Ireland and Britain, sacred wells, islands, and river crossings served similar ritual functions. Despite local differences, the underlying principle remains. Geography was a medium of sacred authority, shaping both ritual practice and communal organization. Sacred landscapes also codified legal and political functions. Hilltop groves often hosted assemblies, dispute resolution, and ceremonial inauguration of leaders, integrating social governance with religious observance. Water sites functioned as markers for boundary negotiation, oath-taking, and protective ritual, embedding law and authority within spatially and spiritually defined locations. These practices illustrate how sacred landscapes were not merely symbolic but operationally central to community regulation, memory, and cohesion. Finally, the interaction between natural sanctuaries and myth is notable. Stories link specific rivers, springs, and groves with divine or heroic events, reinforcing the cultural significance of these sites. Narrative reinforcement of sacred geography ensured that ritual practice, local identity, and mythological memory were mutually constitutive, producing a cohesive framework for understanding both the physical and metaphysical world. By combining archaeological, textual, and landscape evidence, it is evident that groves, springs, and rivers functioned as central nodes of ritual, social, and mythic activity. These sites structured ritual behavior, guiding collective action, encoding moral and social norms, and sustaining continuity of belief across generations, forming the foundation for broader sacred landscapes examined in subsequent sections. sacrifice regulated cosmic balance. Material offerings were central to Celtic religious practice, functioning as physical mediators between human society and the divine or otherworldly realms. Archaeological evidence across Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe demonstrates a systematic approach to ritual deposition, including weapon caches, animal remains, and bog offerings, reflecting deliberate and socially sanctioned forms of devotion. These practices indicate that sacrifice was not arbitrary violence but a regulated mechanism to maintain cosmic order, political legitimacy, and communal cohesion. Weapon deposits are among the most prominent forms of material devotion. Archaeologists have uncovered swords, spears, shields, and occasionally chariot components intentionally placed in rivers, lakes, or wetland contexts. Analysis of wear patterns, breakage, and deposition contexts suggests that these were ritual offerings rather than discarded or lost equipment, often associated with significant events such as territorial defense, seasonal festivals, or leadership transitions. Classical sources, including Julius Caesar, corroborate these practices, noting that Gaulish and British Celts dedicated weapons to deities following victory or as supplication for favor in future conflicts. Animal sacrifice functioned alongside material deposition to reinforce social and cosmological order. Remains of cattle, pigs, and occasionally horses in ritual contexts, often accompanied by metalwork or ceramic vessels, demonstrate structured sacrificial practice. Osteological evidence indicates selective butchering patterns, suggesting ritualized methods designed to distinguish ceremonial slaughter from subsistence consumption. These sacrifices were frequently integrated into communal feasting, reinforcing both social bonds and spiritual efficacy, while symbolically linking the human community with the cycles of the natural and supernatural world. Bog offerings provide additional insight into the ritualized deployment of material culture. Objects ranging from jewelry and metalwork to weapons and occasionally human remains were deliberately deposited in wetlands, sometimes accompanied by votive inscriptions or symbolic markers. The anaerobic conditions of bogs preserved these materials, offering a unique archaeological window into ritual practice. Interpretation suggests that bog deposits functioned as liminal exchanges, returning valuable or potent items to the landscape or deities, thus ensuring protection, fertility, or political favor. The repetition and standardization of such deposits indicate long-term ritual continuity and communal oversight. Interpretive analysis highlights several functional principles. First, sacrificial practice codified relationships between humans, landscape, and divine authority, embedding societal norms in material form. Second, offerings operated as regulatory mechanisms, maintaining balance between elite authority, community obligation, and supernatural forces. Third, the materiality of devotion reinforced social stratification and political legitimacy, as elite warriors and leaders frequently directed or contributed to these rituals, demonstrating both power and responsibility. Ritual deposition extended beyond objects to humans in select contexts, though these remain rare and heavily debated. Osteological and contextual analysis suggests that human sacrifice, when present, followed structured patterns tied to cosmological, political, or martial events. Literary references, including Irish sagas, describe ritualized killings in connection with sovereignty, boundary defense, or divine appeasement, reflecting ritual norms that integrated human bodies into social and cosmic frameworks. These practices underscore the broader principle that material and bodily devotion were mutually reinforcing in Celtic ritual systems. Regional variation in sacrificial practice is evident. Continental Gaul emphasizes weapon and horse deposits, while Irish contexts highlight cattle, bog offerings, and occasional human involvement. Despite differences in form, the underlying function, regulating social, cosmic, and political balance through material dedication, remains consistent. Archaeological patterns, corroborated by classical and medieval sources, demonstrate that these practices were socially embedded, repeatable, and codified within communal and ritual frameworks. Finally, offerings and sacrifice are closely tied to ritualized memory and mythic reinforcement. Deposited objects often reference heroic, divine, or legendary events, creating a tangible connection between past narratives and present ritual action. By embedding symbolic meaning into objects, communities ensured that devotion reinforced social cohesion, transmitted ethical norms, and maintained continuity between human and divine spheres. Through careful archaeological and textual analysis, it is evident that offerings, sacrifice, and material devotion were central to Celtic ritual practice. Ritual extended to the human body, object, and landscape alike, encoding social, political, and cosmological principles within deliberate acts of deposition, thus maintaining order, authority, and continuity across generations. Death was transition, not termination. Celtic conceptions of death and the afterlife were deeply intertwined with ritual practice and sacred geography. Burial traditions, from cremation and inhumation to elaborate grave goods, indicate a belief system in which death represented a passage into the otherworld, a parallel realm that maintained continuity with the living community. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that funerary practices were structured, socially differentiated, and integrated with broader cosmological frameworks, reflecting both social status and spiritual expectation. Burial practices varied regionally and chronologically. In Hallstatt and La Tène, Europe, elite burials frequently included weapons, jewelry, and feasting vessels, signaling the deceased's social rank and functional role in life. Cremation urns, sometimes placed within ritual enclosures or tumuli, indicate concern for proper disposal and continuity of identity. Osteological analysis demonstrates careful preparation of the body, including positioning, wrapping, and occasionally secondary deposition, suggesting that funerary rites were codified and performed with ritual precision. Archaeological parallels in Ireland, Britain, and Gaul show continuity of these practices, emphasizing that death was socially and spiritually significant rather than merely biological. The otherworld was conceptualized as a layered, parallel reality intersecting with the human world at sacred sites, through liminal times and via ritual action. Grave goods, offerings, and symbolic deposits may have functioned to equip the deceased for their journey, maintain social ties, and reinforce communal memory. Literary sources, including early Irish sagas and mythic cycles, describe interactions with the otherworld in ways that mirror these funerary practices. Journeys, encounters with supernatural guardians, and the restoration of social or cosmic balance. This alignment suggests that death rituals materialized mythic principles, embedding beliefs about continuity, power, and honor into physical practice. Interpretive insights emerge from these patterns. First, burial practices demonstrate social codification, with material differentiation reflecting hierarchy, role, and communal expectation. Second, the alignment of grave goods and ritual deposition with mythic narratives underscores the integration of belief and practice, linking living communities with spiritual realities. Third, these practices functioned as mechanisms of cultural memory, ensuring that individuals' contributions, lineage, and societal roles persisted symbolically beyond death. Evidence also points to localized adaptation of burial and ritual practice. In continental Gaul, large tumuli and fortified cemeteries highlight elite visibility and territorial assertion, while in Ireland, ring fort burials and insular tumuli reflect integration with ritualized domestic or landscape spaces. Cremation practices, pit burials, and deposition of votive objects in water or bogs illustrate flexibility in ritual expression while maintaining the underlying principle. Death-mediated ongoing social, spiritual, and cosmological order. The interplay between material culture and narrative further reinforces continuity. Objects deposited with the deceased, such as weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial items, serve as both functional and symbolic conduits, linking mythic ideals of heroism, status, and cosmology to lived experience. Similarly, textual sources recount journeys to the otherworld or encounters with deceased heroes, aligning narrative structures with archaeological evidence. These convergences demonstrate that Celtic conceptions of death were both pragmatic and ideological, encoding social norms, ethical expectations, and spiritual belief within funerary practice. Finally, burial and funerary rituals established the foundation for later cultural encounters and transformations. The structured integration of death, ritual, and myth would be challenged and transformed by Roman conquest, Christianization, and subsequent socio-political shifts. Nonetheless, continuity of symbolic practice, material deposition, and ritualized treatment of the dead illustrates the enduring resilience of Celtic cosmology and its integration with social hierarchy. Through archaeological, textual, and comparative analysis, it is evident that death was treated as a transitional process, managed through carefully codified rituals, symbolic deposits, and belief in the otherworld. These practices ensured continuity of social, spiritual, and cosmological order, providing a coherent framework that both reinforced communal norms and preserved mythic memory. These practices would be challenged by Roman power, setting the stage for transformation and adaptation in the subsequent historical era. Rome renamed the gods. As Roman expansion reached Celtic territories, classical observers employed interpretatio Romana, a method of equating local deities with Roman counterparts, producing a form of religious syncretism evident in both inscriptions and iconography. Celtic gods were often reinterpreted through Roman frameworks. Lugus became Mercury, Epona retained distinct equine associations, and Titatis was linked with Mars, allowing Roman administrators and settlers to conceptualize foreign divine hierarchies within familiar structures. Archaeological evidence, including inscribed altars, dedications, and reliefs, demonstrates both the practical and symbolic effects of this identification, reflecting integration of local and imperial religious practice. Inscriptions across Gaul, Britain, and parts of Germany provide concrete documentation. Altars dedicated to Mercury Lugudunensis or Matris/Virtuts Locales illustrate the blending of Celtic and Roman religious identities. Iconographic features, such as depictions of deities riding horses, holding weapons, or presiding over fertility symbols, show continuity of indigenous attributes even as Roman names and ritual forms were imposed. These artifacts reveal a dynamic negotiation of belief, rather than passive assimilation. Local populations actively retained mythic meaning while accommodating imperial frameworks. Syncretism also functioned administratively and socially. By equating local gods with Roman equivalents, provincial authorities facilitated governance, encouraged loyalty, and provided a shared religious vocabulary across culturally diverse populations. Ritual practice, including public festivals, temple dedications, and votive offerings, often incorporated both Celtic and Roman elements, producing hybrid forms that were recognizable to multiple communities. Archaeological sites such as Gallo-Roman sanctuaries demonstrate continuity of sacred space, even when formal cultic practices were modified under imperial influence. Interpretive insights emerge from these patterns. First, Interpretatio Romana reflects cultural pragmatism, allowing Romans to map their cosmology onto Celtic belief without erasing indigenous structures. Second, hybridized worship highlights resilience of local identity, as native attributes, myths, and functions persisted alongside Roman nomenclature. Third, material and textual evidence together illustrate active negotiation of religious meaning, where syncretism was both imposed and selectively adapted, producing a spectrum of devotional expression. Regional variation is significant. In areas such as southern Gaul, where Roman administration and settlement were dense, syncretism is highly visible, with elaborate temples, inscriptions, and iconography blending Roman and Celtic motifs. In more remote regions, such as northern Britain and Ireland, indirect contact limited Roman religious influence, preserving more traditional forms of Celtic worship. The variation demonstrates that syncretism was contingent upon proximity, political integration, and local choice, rather than being uniform across Celtic Europe. This process had implications for mythological continuity and transformation. Gods retained functional domains, fertility, war, sovereignty, but Roman framing often altered narrative emphasis. For example, Lugus as Mercury emphasizes commerce and communication over martial skill or sovereignty, subtly redirecting cultural perception. Such transformations illustrate how imperial context reoriented mythic roles, influencing subsequent literary and ritual traditions while preserving underlying Celtic cosmology. Finally, syncretism set a precedent for later religious and cultural adaptation. The Roman overlay introduced new iconography, legal sanction, and public cultic structure, which would interact with early Christianization centuries later. By documenting Interpretatio Romana, inscriptions, and hybridized artifacts, it is evident that Roman contact reshaped Celtic divine practice, producing both continuity and transformation that reverberated across ritual, myth, and social life. Through archaeological, epigraphic, and comparative analysis, it is clear that Roman identification of Celtic deities served as both an administrative tool and a medium for cultural negotiation. Not all regions experienced direct conquest, but where syncretism occurred, it produced a nuanced transformation of Celtic myth, blending indigenous tradition with imperial frameworks while preserving essential functional and symbolic elements of the native pantheon. Empire reshapes belief unevenly. The encounter between Celtic societies and Roman power produced heterogeneous outcomes, shaped by geography, political integration, and local resilience. In Gaul and southern Britain, direct Roman administration imposed urbanization, taxation, and military occupation, which facilitated religious adaptation and partial syncretism. In contrast, Ireland remained largely autonomous, preserving older ritual practices and mythic narratives relatively intact. This divergence illustrates that imperial influence on belief systems was contingent, producing selective adaptation rather than uniform transformation. In Gaul, archaeological evidence demonstrates extensive Romanization of sacred sites and ritual practice. Temples, altars, and inscriptions show Interpretatio Romana in action, while votive deposits reflect continued indigenous participation. Nevertheless, classical sources suggest persistent local agency. Communities maintained ancestral cults, seasonal festivals, and ritual norms, negotiating continuity alongside adaptation. For example, Gallo-Roman sanctuaries often integrated Roman temple architecture while retaining Celtic motifs and iconography, indicating a hybridized religious landscape that balanced imperial oversight with local meaning. In Britain, similar patterns emerge. Roman towns, military forts, and infrastructure introduced centralized ritual spaces, but rural and peripheral communities continued traditional ceremonies in groves, rivers, and hilltop sites. Archaeological finds, including votive deposits in rivers and bogs, suggest that these localized expressions of devotion persisted beneath the imperial framework. Literary and epigraphic evidence corroborates this duality. While some deities were formally identified with Roman equivalents, others continued to be invoked independently, highlighting the resilience of indigenous spiritual practice. Ireland presents a contrasting case. With minimal Roman presence, Celtic religious traditions remained largely uninterrupted, preserving oral transmission, sacred landscapes, and mythic cycles. Archaeological and textual records indicate continuity in burial practice, hero cults, and ritual deposition, demonstrating that absence of direct conquest allowed myth and ritual to evolve internally rather than under imperial imposition. This comparative perspective emphasizes that cultural resilience depended on political autonomy, geographic isolation, and community cohesion. Interpretive insights emerge from these patterns. First, imperial contact functions as a selective catalyst, reshaping belief where practical or political integration demands compliance while leaving peripheral regions relatively autonomous. Second, survival of myth and ritual demonstrates the flexibility and adaptability of Celtic religious structures, capable of maintaining core cosmological and social principles even under external pressure. Third, hybridization reflects active negotiation, where communities strategically incorporated Roman elements to legitimize authority, maintain ritual efficacy, and preserve local identity. Evidence also indicates the persistence of functional roles within mythology. Even where Roman names and iconography were applied, gods retained their traditional domains, fertility, warfare, and sovereignty, allowing narrative and ritual continuity despite nominal transformation. Heroes, festivals, and sacred landscapes adapted subtly, showing that Celtic cosmology was resilient, modular, and capable of incorporating external influence without losing internal coherence. This uneven transformation highlights the interdependence of political power and religious practice. Where Roman authority was strong, syncretism and adaptation were facilitated through administrative structures, urbanization, and elite mediation. Where authority was weak or absent, traditional practices persisted, sometimes integrating Roman motifs only tangentially. Material culture, including altars, votive deposits, and inscriptions, documents the spectrum, revealing both continuity and transformation in spatial and chronological perspective. Finally, this phase of interaction set the stage for long-term mythological persistence. By selectively integrating Roman frameworks while retaining core beliefs and ritual practice, Celtic communities ensured that mythic cycles, sacred landscapes, and heroic narratives continued to inform social identity. This resilience allowed mythology to survive political upheaval, setting the foundation for transmission into medieval manuscripts, oral tradition, and later literary preservation. Through archaeological, textual, and comparative analysis, it is evident that resistance, adaptation, and survival were uneven across Celtic Europe. Myth persisted under new political realities, demonstrating both the flexibility of belief systems and the capacity of local communities to navigate imperial influence while maintaining continuity of ritual, narrative, and cosmological order. Ritual adapted to authority. Roman contact introduced significant changes to Celtic ritual practice, particularly in the use of sacred spaces and public worship. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence shows that many groves, springs, and rivers, formerly autonomous ritual centers, were incorporated into structured Gallo-Roman sanctuaries. These sites often combined traditional Celtic features with Roman architectural elements, including temples, altars, and formalized precincts, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. The transformation illustrates how ritual practice was responsive to political authority while retaining culturally meaningful forms. Sacred landscapes were often redefined under Roman oversight. Groves and hilltop sanctuaries, previously open and communal, became associated with specific civic or elite functions, integrating ritual with urbanized structures such as forums or administrative centers. Water sources, formerly sites of votive deposition, were occasionally linked to Roman healing cults or public dedications. Yet indigenous symbolism persisted through the continued placement of traditional offerings and localized iconography. Archaeological strata indicate temporal continuity in votive practice, demonstrating that adaptation did not fully supplant prior ritual behaviors. Material evidence further illustrates the hybridization of worship. Inscriptions dedicated to Mercury, Epona, or Matries often coexist with local Celtic motifs, including animals, abstract patterns, and symbolic implements. These hybrid artifacts suggest that communities actively negotiated the integration of Roman religious authority while maintaining meaningful connections to indigenous cosmology. Ritual performance likewise adapted. Festivals, sacrifices, and communal feasts were increasingly aligned with Roman calendars and civic occasions, blending political compliance with enduring spiritual practice. Interpretive insights highlight three key dynamics. First, ritual adaptation demonstrates strategic accommodation, allowing communities to maintain core cosmological and social functions under imperial oversight. Second, material continuity in votive deposits and sacred iconography indicates resilience of symbolic meaning, even as formal contexts shifted. Third, transformation of space and ceremony reveals the intersection of religious, social, and political authority, where adaptation served both communal and administrative purposes. Regional variation is notable. In Gaul, urbanized sanctuaries exemplify highly integrated Roman Celtic worship, whereas rural and peripheral areas show less structural alteration, retaining open-air groves and water rituals. In Britain, military forts and towns introduced formalized ceremonial precincts, yet hill forts and sacred springs remained loci for indigenous practice. Across these regions, ritual adaptation was context-dependent, reflecting local political realities, accessibility to Roman authority, and community priorities. This transformation also influenced mythic perception and narrative practice. By situating traditional deities within Roman frameworks and public spaces, the symbolic authority of gods and ritual performance shifted toward civic recognition. Mythological roles, fertility, sovereignty, protection were maintained in narrative and material form, but public worship became more structured, codified, and visibly tied to political authority, altering communal engagement without erasing prior cosmological principles. Finally, these adaptations laid the groundwork for subsequent religious transformation. The Roman overlay introduced patterns of formalized worship, spatial organization, and syncretic practice that would influence the reception of Christianity. The integration of ritual with authority, coupled with continuity of symbolic forms, created flexible frameworks capable of sustaining belief even amid further ideological change. Through archaeological, epigraphic, and comparative analysis, it is evident that Celtic ritual practice transformed under Roman influence, adapting sacred spaces, public worship, and ceremonial performance to imperial authority. These changes maintained continuity of symbolic meaning and social function while establishing frameworks that would later interface with Christianization. Christianity would later transform myth more deeply, building upon these adapted structures to redefine sacred authority and narrative tradition. Conversion altered meaning, not memory. The introduction of Christianity into Celtic regions from the 4th to 7th centuries CE prompted systematic reinterpretation of pre-Christian myth, as missionaries sought to integrate indigenous beliefs within the new religious framework. Rather than erasing prior narratives entirely, Christian reformers reframed gods, heroes, and sacred spaces to align with doctrinal imperatives. Literary sources, including hagiographies, annals, and monastic compilations, demonstrate this process, preserving the core structure and motifs of Celtic mythology while recasting them as allegorical or moral exemplars. Monastic centers became key agents in this reinterpretation. Scriptoria in Ireland, Britain, and Brittany collected oral narratives, genealogies, and ritual lore, transcribing them in Latin or vernacular forms. Texts such as the Liber Gabala Irene, the Martyrology of Tala, and early saints' lives illustrate how mythic cycles were retained within Christian moral frameworks, portraying pagan deities as precursors, historical figures, or cautionary exemplars. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites, including manuscript fragments and inscribed stones, supports the intentional preservation and adaptation of older mythic content. Interpretive insights emerge from these processes. First, Christianization did not eliminate pagan memory. Rather, it redirected narrative authority, preserving genealogical, heroic, and cosmological structures while reshaping their theological interpretation. Second, the adaptation reflects a strategic engagement by missionaries, who leveraged familiar mythic motifs to facilitate conversion and cultural continuity. Third, the transcription of oral tradition into monastic texts ensured intergenerational transmission, allowing myth to survive in mediated, literate form. The redefinition of sacred spaces further illustrates this adaptive strategy. Many former groves, wells, and ritual sites were recontextualized as Christian sanctuaries, dedicated to saints or holy relics. Archaeological continuity of offerings, pilgrimage patterns, and ritual observance indicates that community attachment to sacred geography persisted, even as theological meaning shifted. This practice underscores the pragmatic and integrative nature of Celtic Christianization, balancing doctrinal conformity with local custom. Regional variation is significant. Ireland, largely outside Roman political control, exhibited robust preservation of mythic cycles within monastic contexts, while in Britain and Gaul, integration with Roman Christian structures often emphasized doctrinal conformity over narrative fidelity. Nonetheless, both regions display evidence that storytelling, ritual memory, and mythic archetypes endured, illustrating the resilience of Celtic narrative frameworks under religious transformation. Finally, conversion influenced literary and historiographical forms. Pagan heroes and deities were often historicized, moralized, or allegorized, creating interpretive continuity between mythic past and Christian present. By encoding these narratives within genealogical, hagiographical, and analytic frameworks, monastic scribes preserved myth while subordinating it to Christian epistemology, ensuring both cultural memory and religious orthodoxy. Through textual, archaeological, and comparative analysis, It is evident that Christian missionaries altered the meaning of Celtic myth without erasing its memory. Conversion reframed deities, heroes, and sacred sites, but preserved structural, genealogical, and narrative continuity. Monastic centers became preservers of tradition, safeguarding mythic heritage for subsequent generations while mediating its transformation within a Christianized worldview. Gods became ancestors. As Christian scribes transcribed Celtic myth, they frequently employed euhemerization, the process of converting divine figures into historical or quasi-historical characters. Manuscripts such as the Liber Gabala Iren, Foras Fisa Ar Aaron, and early Welsh chronicles present gods and supernatural heroes as ancestral leaders, tribal founders, or legendary kings, situating myth within a temporal genealogical framework compatible with Christian historiography. This method preserved narrative content while aligning it with doctrinal and historiographical expectations, effectively transforming religious myth into pseudo-history. The preservation of myth through manuscripts was both deliberate and selective. Monastic scribes prioritized genealogical, heroic, and moral narratives that could support social, political, or ecclesiastical frameworks, while elements deemed excessively pagan, erotic, or magical were often omitted, sanitized, or reinterpreted. This process produced a corpus that is both fragmentary and curated, reflecting monastic priorities in maintaining cultural memory without contradicting Christian norms. The surviving texts, therefore, offer a mediated glimpse into pre-Christian belief, emphasizing structural and thematic continuity over literal accuracy. Interpretive insights reveal the significance of euhemerization. First, it allowed continuity of cultural memory, embedding heroes, deities, and cosmological narratives within a socially legible and morally acceptable format. Second, it demonstrates monastic interpretive agency, as scribes actively chose which aspects of oral tradition to preserve and how to frame them. Third, euhemerization reflects didactic intent, positioning mythic ancestors as exemplars of leadership, valor, or morality for Christianized audiences, thereby linking past narrative frameworks to contemporary social and ecclesiastical values. Material and textual evidence supports this transformation. Manuscripts often include genealogical tables, analytic references, and marginal glosses, situating mythic events in chronological order or linking them to historical figures. For example, Luff and the Tuatha De Danann are frequently presented as leaders of successive invasions or lineages, maintaining their narrative prominence while recasting their supernatural attributes as legendary accomplishments. Similarly, heroic cycles such as the Ulster or Fenian narratives are occasionally reframed as historical conflicts among tribes or dynasties, preserving structural relationships and motifs. Regional variation influenced manuscript preservation. In Ireland, monastic centers such as Clonmacnoise, Armagh, and Kildare produced extensive compilations, while in Wales and Brittany, oral tradition was gradually written down in bilingual contexts, often blending Latin, Welsh, and vernacular Celtic. Despite differences, the common mechanism of euhemerization demonstrates a consistent strategy. Mythic content was transformed into genealogical and pseudo-historical form, ensuring its survival under Christian orthodoxy. Finally, this process highlights the limits and selectivity of preservation. Not all myths were equally transmitted. Ritual details, cosmological structures, and localized deity worship were often underrepresented or lost, emphasizing narrative and genealogical coherence over liturgical fidelity. Nevertheless, the euhemerized corpus ensured that key figures, stories, and social motifs continued to inform cultural identity, heroic ideals, and historical consciousness. Through manuscript, textual, and comparative analysis, it is evident that monastic scribes preserved Celtic myth by converting gods into ancestral and legendary figures. This euhemerization maintained narrative continuity while conforming to Christian historiographical norms. This preservation was selective, privileging genealogical, heroic, and moral elements, and establishing a foundation for later medieval literature that both retained and reshaped the mythic imagination. Myth survived by adaptation. Even as Christianization transformed ritual practice and religious belief, Celtic myth persisted through integration into literary and legal frameworks. Early Irish law tracts, sagas, and poetic compilations incorporated mythic motifs, hero archetypes, and cosmological principles, embedding them within socially functional and narratively compelling forms. Manuscripts such as the Senchas Mar Book of Leinster and Tain Buachálnge demonstrate that mythic structures continued to inform concepts of justice, kinship, and political authority, illustrating the adaptability of narrative memory under new ideological conditions. Legal texts often codified mythic precedent, referencing heroic exemplars or divine principles to justify social norms and adjudicate disputes. Concepts such as honor price, heroic, fosterage, and kingship obligations were frequently illustrated through narrative analogues drawn from heroic cycles, linking mythic behavior to codified legal expectation. This integration ensured that myth remained socially relevant, shaping ethical, political, and judicial understanding even as the original religious context receded. Literary preservation was equally significant. Medieval manuscripts retained epic cycles, mythological, Ulster, and Fenian, while Christian glosses and marginal commentary reframed content to align with moral or theological interpretation. Poetic and narrative forms enabled the transmission of cultural memory, ensuring that heroic ideals, cosmological concepts, and sacred geography persisted in collective consciousness. The structured retelling of these stories allowed myth to function simultaneously as entertainment, moral instruction, and historical exemplar. Interpretive insights highlight the mechanisms of survival. First, mythic content was embedded in socially operative structures, ensuring continued relevance within legal, literary, and educational domains. Second, adaptation demonstrates the flexibility of narrative systems, capable of accommodating theological, political, and social transformation without losing core motifs. Third, the interweaving of literature and law produced a self-reinforcing cultural matrix, in which heroic precedent, moral principle, and historical memory mutually supported one another. Regional and temporal variation influenced preservation. In Ireland, monastic scribes and legal scholars curated a rich corpus of myth integrated into both secular and ecclesiastical frameworks, while in Wales and Brittany, oral tradition supplemented written records, producing hybridized forms. In both contexts, myth was mediated through narrative, legal, and performative channels, ensuring continuity even in the absence of traditional ritual practice. The endurance of myth through literature and law underscores the distinction between belief and cultural memory. While pagan worship declined, narrative structures, heroic ideals, and symbolic cosmologies persisted, influencing storytelling, social norms, and political thought. Myth was no longer primarily religious but functioned as a cultural repository, preserving identity, ethical models, and collective history for future generations. Finally, these processes highlight the long-term impact of adaptation. By embedding mythic content in durable literary and legal forms, Celtic communities preserved narrative, cosmological, and social knowledge beyond the lifespan of traditional religious belief. This ensured that the legacy of Celtic mythology persisted as a foundational element of cultural memory, informing medieval literature, historiography, and later nationalist imagination. Through textual, legal, and comparative analysis, it is evident that Celtic myth survived by adaptation, transmitted through law, literature, and narrative structure. Legacy would outlast belief, preserving heroic cycles, cosmological frameworks, and social norms as enduring cultural reference points even in a Christianized world. Evidence defines certainty. Reconstructing Celtic mythology and society relies on a triangulation of archaeological, textual, and comparative linguistic evidence. Archaeology provides material anchors. Burials, votive deposits, ritual sites, and iconography illuminate social hierarchy, ritual practice, and symbolic expression. Texts, from classical accounts to medieval manuscripts, offer narrative, genealogical, and cosmological information, while comparative linguistics situates Celtic myths within broader Indo-European patterns. Together, these sources allow scholars to identify core motifs, structural principles, and functional roles of gods, heroes, and sacred landscapes. Burial and ritual evidence is particularly informative. Elite tombs, weapon caches, and bog offerings demonstrate structured cosmology, hierarchies, and ritual behavior, corroborating textual accounts of heroism, sovereignty, and divine mediation. Iconography on metalwork, sculpture, and coinage reflects symbolic vocabulary associated with deities, sacred animals, and cosmological motifs, revealing continuity of belief and social ideology. The consistency of these patterns across regions, from Gaul to Ireland, provides a reliable foundation for reconstructing ritual and symbolic structures. Textual evidence, while filtered through later Christianization, preserves narrative frameworks, heroic cycles, and mythic archetypes. Manuscripts such as Liber Gabala Iren, Tain Boquelnge, and Welsh mythic compilations retain structural and functional characteristics of pre-Christian myth. Cross-referencing these with archaeology and classical accounts enables scholars to distinguish indigenous elements from later Christian reinterpretation, supporting methodologically rigorous reconstructions of mythic, social, and ritual systems. Comparative linguistic analysis provides additional validation. Proto-Celtic and Indo-European roots clarify deity functions, cosmological concepts, and ritual terminology, linking Celtic myth to broader mythological frameworks. Recurring motifs, tripartite cosmology, sovereignty goddesses, and hero-warrior archetypes are identifiable across texts and material culture, indicating structural continuity despite regional variation. Interpretive insights clarify methodology. First, reconstruction emphasizes patterns and functions rather than literal narrative content, focusing on what is consistently attested across evidence types. Second, archaeological and textual convergence highlights the interplay of material practice and narrative ideology, revealing how social structures shaped myth and vice versa. Third, linguistic and comparative frameworks provide external validation, situating Celtic belief systems within broader Indo-European contexts and supporting functional interpretations of deity and hero roles. Nevertheless, limitations are inherent. Preservation bias, Christianized manuscripts, and regional variation introduce uncertainty and interpretive constraint. Archaeological absence does not equal non-existence, and textual embellishment complicates straightforward reconstruction. Methodological rigor, therefore, requires careful cross-referencing and cautious inference, distinguishing probable structures from conjectural narrative elaboration. Finally, this synthesis demonstrates that, while precise details of ritual, myth, and cosmology may remain elusive, core principles, sacred authority, heroism, cosmological structure, and social integration, can be reliably reconstructed. These elements form a robust framework for understanding Celtic culture and its enduring mythological legacy. Through archaeological, textual, and linguistic evidence, it is clear that reconstruction is possible where evidence converges. Patterns of ritual, heroism, and cosmology can be confidently identified, providing a methodologically sound foundation for the study of Celtic mythology and society. Uncertainty remains unavoidable, yet careful scholarship allows for a clear and credible portrayal of this complex cultural world. Silence is also evidence. The study of Celtic mythology and society is inevitably shaped by gaps, biases, and interpretive constraints. Archaeological evidence is fragmentary. Many ritual sites, burials, and settlements remain undiscovered or poorly preserved, while organic materials often decay, leaving incomplete records. Textual sources, particularly medieval manuscripts, reflect Christianized reinterpretation, regional variation, and selective preservation. Classical accounts are similarly problematic, filtered through Roman ethnographic perspectives, political agendas, and limited knowledge. These factors require scholars to treat the evidence critically, acknowledging both presence and absence. Interpretive bias further complicates reconstruction. Early modern, nationalist, and romantic approaches often exaggerated continuity, moralized myth, or projected contemporary social values onto Celtic culture. Modern scholarship emphasizes methodological rigor, cross-referencing archaeology, text, and linguistics to mitigate cultural and temporal bias, but uncertainties remain inherent. For example, the precise function of ritual deposition, whether votive, funerary, or symbolic, can rarely be definitively determined without corroborating textual or contextual evidence. Gaps in the record also constrain understanding of regional variation and chronological development. Material evidence is concentrated in certain areas, Gaul, southern Britain, and Ireland, while peripheral regions remain poorly documented. Manuscript transmission favors certain mythic cycles, particularly Ulster and Fenian traditions, leaving other narratives fragmentary or lost. Linguistic reconstruction can illuminate Proto-Celtic cosmology, but many nuances of local practice and mythic detail remain indeterminate. Scholarly debate reflects these challenges. Questions persist regarding the degree of Roman influence versus indigenous continuity, the original function of sacred landscapes, and the historical versus symbolic interpretation of mythic figures. Some scholars emphasize functionalist perspectives, interpreting myth and ritual as social tools or cosmological mechanisms, while others adopt narrative or literary approaches, focusing on storytelling, motif, and symbolic resonance. These debates illustrate that multiple analytical lenses are necessary, and that certainty is often probabilistic rather than absolute. Interpretive insights emerge from acknowledging limits. First, absence of evidence is itself informative, signaling potential ritual or social practice while highlighting preservation biases. Second, critical engagement with textual and material sources emphasizes the provisional nature of reconstruction, fostering cautious inference over speculative assertion. Third, scholarly debate functions as a corrective mechanism, refining understanding through comparative, multidisciplinary analysis and emphasizing evidence-based interpretation over narrative convenience. Despite these challenges, convergence across archaeology, text, and linguistics provides credible reconstructions of core social and mythic structures, including hierarchical ritual, hero archetypes, and cosmological organization. While many details remain uncertain, specific deity attributes, localized rituals, or precise chronological sequences, the broader framework of Celtic myth and society is robustly supported by cumulative evidence. Finally, acknowledging limitations underscores the importance of methodological transparency. Scholars can present well-supported conclusions while clarifying conjectural elements, ensuring that audiences understand both what is known and what remains speculative. This approach balances rigor with accessibility, preserving credibility while conveying the richness of Celtic mythology. Through critical analysis of gaps, biases, and interpretive challenges, it is evident that evidence has limits, and silence itself informs understanding. Nonetheless, scholarly methods allow reconstruction of central patterns and structures. Despite uncertainty, the legacy endures, providing a coherent and credible framework for the cultural, social, and mythological world of the Celts. Celtic mythology endures through structure, not survival. By the end of the first millennium CE, Celtic myth had undergone profound transformation, shaped by migration, material culture, Roman contact, and Christianization. Despite these changes, a coherent structural system persisted, encompassing cosmology, deity function, hero archetypes, ritual practice, and social norms. Archaeology, textual evidence, and linguistic analysis demonstrate that mythology operated as an integrated historical system, encoding social, political, and cosmological order even as the literal belief in gods and supernatural beings waned. This perspective emphasizes functional continuity. Gods and heroes served consistent roles across time. Sovereignty, fertility, warrior leadership, and moral exemplarity. Sacred landscapes continued to anchor ritual practice, whether in pre-Roman groves, Romanized temples, or Christianized holy wells. Heroic cycles, whether in the Ulster, Fenian, or mythological traditions, preserved narrative templates for social organization, honor codes, and martial behavior. These structural consistencies indicate that mythology was not static storytelling but a system for organizing human experience within a cosmological framework. Interpretive insights highlight the analytical value of this perspective. First, examining mythology as a system clarifies the interdependence of narrative, ritual, and social hierarchy, revealing patterns that transcend individual texts or artifacts. Second, structural continuity explains how myths could survive even when literal belief declined, as their functional roles, modeling heroism, legitimizing authority, and regulating ritual, remained culturally relevant. Third, situating Celtic myth historically demonstrates its adaptive capacity, enabling communities to negotiate external influence while retaining core organizational principles. Cross-temporal and cross-regional analysis underscores the resilience of Celtic mythic structures. Proto-Indo-European motifs persisted through Hallstatt and La Tène material culture, the Ulster and Fenian cycles codified heroism, and Christian monastic manuscripts preserved genealogies and ritual narratives. Even where syncretism, euhemerization, or Christian reinterpretation altered surface content, the underlying cosmological, social, and narrative architecture remained identifiable. This continuity provides a robust framework for historical reconstruction, supporting both academic inquiry and cultural understanding. Furthermore, viewing Celtic mythology as a historical system emphasizes its interrelation with material culture, law, and ritual practice. Iconography, burial rites, votive deposition, and sacred geography consistently encode cosmological and social values, reinforcing narrative patterns found in textual sources. Legal tracts and heroic exemplars illustrate the practical application of mythic principles, linking abstract cosmology with everyday governance, ethical behavior, and social cohesion. The durability of these patterns demonstrates that myth functioned as a living system rather than a collection of stories. Finally, the historical perspective illuminates the legacy of Celtic mythology beyond direct belief. Its structural principles influenced medieval literature, historiography, and cultural memory, informing subsequent storytelling, heroic ideals, and national identity. The survival of motifs, narrative cycles, and symbolic frameworks attests to the enduring power of structured mythology. Even when deities are no longer worshipped, their roles, relationships, and functions continue to shape cultural imagination. Through synthesis of archaeology, texts, and comparative analysis, it is evident that Celtic mythology persists not through literal survival of belief but through enduring structural coherence. Its integrated system of gods, heroes, ritual, and cosmology provides a methodologically sound framework for understanding the historical Celts, offering clarity, continuity, and analytical insight. If you found this exploration of Celtic mythology illuminating, subscribe to Nightfall History for more immersive, academically grounded documentaries on ancient civilizations and their enduring legacies. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on new releases, and explore our playlists to journey deeper into the myths, empires, and cultures that shaped human history. Settle in, fall asleep to history, or revisit the past with fresh eyes. Every story is waiting to be discovered.